şey yaparsın. Middlesex Üniversitesi'nin önemli özelliklerinden biri, İngiltere'de en çok Türk asıllı veya Türkçe konuşan kişiyi istihdam eden bir üniversite olmasıdır. Buradan başlayarak da şöyle bir, yani bugün izlediğiniz sempozyumu yarattık. Niyetimiz iki şekilde. İngilizlere Türkiye'yi daha iyi tanıtmak, bir de Middlesex Üniversitesi'nde görev yapan arkadaşların Türkiye ile ilgili projelerini, Türkiye ile ilgili araştırmalarını daha geniş bir topluluğa tanıtmak şeklinde. Hedeflerimizden biri, Londra'da bulunan yaşayan Türk asıllı cemaatlerin, Türk asıllı derneklerin bizim burada ne yaptığımız, ne gibi araştırmalar yürüttüğümüzü de değerlendirmeleri ve toplum ve üniversite arasında yeni bağların bulunması. Ayrıca daha da önemli olarak da Middlesex Üniversitesi'nin Türkiye ile olan organik bağlarını, Türk üniversiteleri olan bağlarını geliştirmek ve bunu iki ülkenin de yararını daha da ileriye götürmektir. Yani bugünkü sempozyumun ana hatlarıyla temel vurguları budur.
Ümit Bey, kendinizi tanıtır mısınız? Middlesex Üniversitesi'ndeki böyle bir öğretim üyesiniz.
Eksik olmayın. Yani Middlesex Üniversitesi'nin ben artık emektarı sayılırım. Tabiri caizse uzatmaları oynuyorum. Yani yavaş yavaş böyle emekli ben. 30 yıldır Middlesex Üniversitesi'nde görev yapıyorum. 30 yılda böyle tek tük yabancı olmaktan dediğim gibi 20 küsur kişilik bir sadece Türk asıllı, Türkçe konuşan 20 kişilik bir grubumuz var. Ayrıca Türk üniversiteleriyle çok yakın ilişkilerimiz oluştu. ODTÜ'yle güzel ilişkilerimiz oluştu. Arkasından Koç Üniversitesi'yle. Benim görevim daha çok mesleki yönde doktora programları, yani mesleklere yönelik, pratiğe yönelik doktora programları düzenleyip onları yönetmektir. Bunu da bu programla ilgili olaraktan çeşitli girişimlerimiz oldu. Bunlardan biri dediğim ODTÜ Üniversitesi'yle. Koç Üniversitesi'yle de yakın ve sıcak ilişkilerimiz var. Kuzey Kıbrıs'ta da çok iyi alışverişimiz oldu, ilişkilerimiz oldu. Bunları değerlendirip bunları daha da geliştirmek istiyoruz. Bugünkü toplantının bir şeyi de oldu.
Bugünkü toplantının mimarı sizsiniz ama, değil mi? Yani siz organize ettiniz.
Yani şöyle diyelim, yani fikir bizim burada çalışan arkadaşlardan çıktı. Geçen sene bunu yapacakken biraz daha başka bir şekilde, yani niyet vardı, bugüne kısmet oldu. Öyle diyelim. Yani burada bir inisiyatif şeklinde.
Tamam, istersen
actually prepared a pamphlet and said that this was really my design, So he was arrested and brought before actually one of those court-martials and sentenced actually to death.
And he was actually executed. This is 1926, right after he objected to the reform of wearing the Westminster Act.
To build a republic out of post-war chaos, Ataturk believed the needs of the state had to come before the rights of an individual.
If you were an opponent of Ataturk's, you would know about it. But on the other hand, there was nowhere near the level of brutality or brutalization that you saw with, shall we say, Stalin, his exact counterpart in the Soviet Union. There was nowhere near the level of brutalization you see in China with Mao Zedong.
He is very criticized today by multiple groups, but as a nationalist leader that started a new country and was able to adapt this old imperial state and society very quickly to become a productive nation in the new world, he was very successful at that.
Fairly clearly you can see when we got together to talk about how we navigated the Ottoman heritage and how the work of Emma and Warren was navigating it. You can see why that was an episode that we thought was worth including. And I think the use of the word binary is quite relevant in terms of looking at this episode, because you identity connected to conscious political decisions about how you project an identity of a people, of a state. And of course, it was referred to there, how you see a moment where you where you look at the symbolism and the significance and meanings of the turban in the 19th century and the arrival of the fez and then the departure of the fez in that context. I think that was something that we found was a very obvious but engaging and shocking meeting point between subjects that we were talking about.
We're going to move over to Warren's paper. Warren, would you like me to play the clip first, or do you want to play it? Yeah? Okay. Warren's going to be talking about negotiating the Ottoman heritage in the Balkan city, practices in place and street culture in Sarajevo and Bucharest, not Turkey. And we'll play this short clip first.
In the heart of Europe is a city that exemplifies Ottoman rule in conquered Christian lands. It's Sarajevo in Bosnia. Saray in Turkish means palace. This was a major Ottoman city built in the 1460s and proudly facing Christian Europe. Just as in Constantinople, the new city offered a degree of religious toleration to enable its own growth. Maya Savic has studied the politics and society of Sarajevo during Ottoman times and helped me spot evidence of the pecking order they introduced.
Right now we are standing in the biggest mosque in Sarajevo. You can just see how the size of it and the splendor and the grandeur of all the arcs. It just tells you that it was kind of a center of trade life, of religious life of Sarajevo.
Was this mosque built in a way to make a statement about Muslim grandeur and located right at the heart of the city? Was it a point that was being made?
Well, certainly there was a point to be made, but in the early Ottoman period, it wasn't really all about showing the grandeur of Islam as a religion and to present it in a good light, to make it closer to the local people. But primarily they wanted to show the grandeur of the Ottoman Empire itself and what they were able to bring to this region that was, in Bosnia at that time, considered backwards.
Built around the same time as the mosque was a Serbian Orthodox church serving the new city's Christian population.
So now we are at the old Orthodox church, and as you see, it is much more humble than the mosque, and this pathway is very narrow. Courtyard is not very big, and you can't even see the bell tower from here because it is very small. So nothing to compare to the grandeur of the mosque that we saw.
But yet they're still very close to each other.
Yes, still very close to each other. Just a couple of minutes walk from the mosque, actually. So it just shows you that people were able to mix on the streets as they left their places of worship, and it serves as evidence that people were free to practice their own religion in their own churches.
Okay, so I'm looking at Sarajevo and Bucharest, and I should explain a wee bit before I start why I'm particularly interested in these places, and really it comes from a perspective of travelling, and yes, I will be subjecting you to a lot of my holiday pictures. In fact, most of these, in fact, maybe 98% of them are my own holiday snaps. But I think why I'm interested in Southeastern Europe and in the Balkans in particular is I'm from Belfast, and I'm quite interested in nationalism and how it works and how nationalist myths work, and also this idea of coexistence, how that can be encouraged, or I'm not one of these people that think, oh, I can bring peace to the Balkans. I'm just interested in the parallels. So, and also in that kind of tension between empires and new states, and how nationalist mythologies are kind of produced and created in opposition to maybe imperial structures. So I've I've written a whole script which is really out of character for me. I never really do this, and I probably won't use it, but if I glance down occasionally, which doesn't look very good for the camera, but if I do glance down occasionally, you have to excuse me just to remember some quotations and stuff like that. The first thing I should mention is what this paper is really about is this idea of being able to walk through the streets of a city and to be able to read the city, to be able to read aspects of its history and aspects of the kind of myth-making and national identity that goes on in various cities just by looking at the walls of the city, by looking at the built environment, by experiencing the built environment. I'm interested in how signs that you see in the city, whether it's things like graffiti, street signs, graphic design if you like, but also the built environment itself. How will these things come together to create a sense of place? Really they're kind of practices of place if you like. They create identity and they're very culturally specific in a way. So I'm looking at both Sarajevo and Bucharest, but I just wanted to start really by looking at the Balkans in general. These images are from Belgrade and from Bucharest, but before I talk about that, I'd just like to talk about this idea of what the Balkans is and how this term came into existence, because we think of the Balkans as something that's been, this word, the Balkans, has been around for forever, really. It's just a natural kind of geographical name for a whole region. But in fact, it's quite recent that this term was coined. Before the 19th century, the Balkans was known more widely as Turkey in Europe. So in a sense, I am talking about Turkey today, but not in the contemporary sense. So this word Balkans, though, was coined by a German geographer called, and this is where I have to look down at my paper, Johann August Zäune. And he came up with the term in 1808 because the empire was starting to retreat at this stage, starting to decline, and places like Greece and Serbia were getting independence. So a new word was needed, and it's sort of based on a mistaken belief that the Balkan mountain chain goes all the way up through the peninsula, all the way up from Bulgaria, all the way up to Slovenia, more or less. But in fact, it's various mountain chains, and it just seemed like a handy way to talk about the whole of southeastern Europe and the whole of that peninsula that had formerly been part of the Ottoman Empire. So it's a kind of post-Ottoman term. And the word Balkans has has various connotations that might have become apparent in the 90s during the conflicts in former Yugoslavia. So lots of connotations for Western Europeans who have, like travelers, historians, have made comments about the Balkans that have given it a particular gloss. There's a Bulgarian historian called Maria Todorova, and she's written quite a bit about this sense of negativity that clings to the word Balkans in the Western European mind. She's quoted Vesna Goldworthy's observation of the region as insufficiently oriental to be considered exotic, and yet always viewed as not quite European, a blank canvas upon which Europe's political unconscious plays out its taboos and hidden anxieties. So this has got a lot to do with really the way Western Europeans view the former Turkish realms and perhaps even Turkey itself, and really has a lot to do with contemporary attitudes to Turkey and its belonging to or not belonging to Europe. However, which obviously has geopolitical consequences when it gets into political mindsets, let's say. So really, even within the Balkans, the term hasn't been universally accepted. So some countries say, yes, we're Balkans. I think Greece is quite happy with the term, but others like Romania are quite, they want to take a kind of step back from the term. So I'll be looking at that today. So this first image really goes back to my idea of looking at the city itself to try and read aspects of identity and myth-making. So the first image you have is it's kind of Serbian nationalist evocation of the Battle of Kosovo from 1389. So we're talking about rather a long time ago, and this battle, the Battle of Kosovo Field, is sort of central to the idea of the Serbian nation. It was a defeat for the Serbs, and it started the whole process of the Ottoman inclusion of Serbia into the empire. So what's interesting about it is that it's very central to the idea of Serbia as a nation, and it's been used over and over again, this idea of this battle as a way of trying to inflame Serbian nationalism in a way. And there's something called the Kosovo curse, which was within Serbian nationalism. It's a kind of curse that was brought into medieval poetry in Serbia. It was a curse by Lazar, the leader of Serbia, who said that it was really a curse on Serbs who didn't fight for Serbia and fight in Kosovo. So it was used, for example, by Milosevic in the 1990s to point at people who wanted to make peace and really to exploit weakness, what he would have viewed as weaknesses in the Serbian nationalist front. So it's interesting because really what it shows is that Serbian nationalism and the myths of Serbian nationalism, the national imaginary, is based around this contact with Turkey and with the Ottoman Empire. And that's really what I'm trying to show with this, that for all of these Balkan countries, this connection with Turkey, or this conflict with Turkey, or this relationship with the Ottoman Empire is central to identity formation. So the next image here on the right, I've got problems with writing that, so if I say the wrong thing, then you'll have to correct me. But you might recognize this character. This is from Bucharest, and this is Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracul III, or Dracula. And why am I talking about Dracula? Well, he is a kind of Romanian folk hero. He's got a very bad reputation in the West, probably due to Bram Stoker's novel. But his story is really connected to the Ottoman Empire quite intimately. He was known to be someone who resisted the empire and to try to keep independence for Wallachia, one of the Romanian lands that was in existence around the time of as the Ottoman Empire was conquering the Balkans. And he had a very intimate relationship with the Ottoman Empire. As a child, he was held hostage in Istanbul. He learned the Quran, he learned to read and write Turkish. When he returned to Wallachia, he ran various campaigns to fight for the independence of the Romanian lands. He got up to all sorts of very nasty kinds of behavior, to put it mildly. So, for example, when the Sultan sent, I think it was Murad II, sent Mehmed II, sent representatives to meet him, he ended up nailing their turbans to their heads. His own head was eventually severed and sent to Istanbul in a jar of honey, and was then displayed on a spike to warn off anyone else who tried to do similar things to him. So what I'm quite interested in is, in the Romanian context, he's kind of considered a nationalist hero to some degree, and you can see this on the walls of the city. So I'm also interested in the actual. Let's think about Bosnia now for a while. I'm interested in the way the urban environment and the built environment within a city like Sarajevo represents ideas about the Ottoman Empire and how that heritage of the Ottoman Empire is used for political ends, really. So within, let me just find my place here. So while the Ottoman heritage is being used as a foil for nationalisms of predominantly Orthodox states such as Serbia and Romania, in Bosnia-Herzegovina the relationship is somewhat more complex. So Bosnia-Herzegovina was brought under Ottoman control from about the 1440s onwards. We saw that in the clip that Sarajevo started to grow around the 1460s. And what's different about Bosnia from other parts of the empire was that it was Islamicized. So much of the population converted to Islam. So as in Albania, much of the population went over to Islam, whereas in Romania and Serbia, they remained Christian. And there's thought to be several reasons for this. There wasn't a sense of forced conversion by any means, but it was the Christian structures of the church at the time in Bosnia were quite weak. There was also a kind of what was known as a heretic kind of Bogumil, non-conformist, Gnostic religious movement that was thought to be more open to the ideas of Islam. And people in those mountainous areas of the Balkans were open to, well, no, what I was going to say was that actual Turkish people from Anatolia or from Turkey itself didn't come to settle in the mountainous regions. They didn't want to, as they did in Bulgaria, so there was a kind of need to encourage conversion to Islam. So it was useful to convert to Islam because you got access to lots of privileges, which was mentioned in the film. For example, you could trade more easily, you could inherit land, that kind of thing. So it was advantageous to people in Bosnia to convert to Islam. So within this idea of Islamicization, you've got the idea of a town centre growing up around the structures of Islam, around the mosque, around the madrasas, around the market and that kind of thing. So we've got this area of the city called Başçarşia, which is the old town, and it's the old Ottoman town within Sarajevo. It's interesting because of the way in which, I'm interested in the way in which that heritage has been used for various identity purposes and political purposes, particularly in the 20th century. So after 1945, that area of the city had kind of gone into ruins, and it was not really being kept up very well. And socialist Yugoslavia decided they didn't really know what to do with it because they were sort of moving away from religion, and this was a kind of embarrassment to them. So the first impulse was to demolish it, to demolish the old city, to demolish the mosques and all the madrasas around it and all the workshops that had grown up around that. So a demolition committee was founded, and they started to demolish lots and lots of the shops and around the mosque under I think it was a slogan called "Our history is not in old shutters." But 200 of these shops were demolished, and then a halt was put to it, and somebody came up with the bright idea that maybe it would be better to keep the whole Ottoman city centre, because it could be used as a way of promoting a kind of multi-ethnic, denominational ideal for a socialist Yugoslavia. So there was a plan drawn up by an architect called Neidhart, and he decided that it would be good to isolate the various monuments within the old city and to sort of highlight them by demolishing areas around them and creating this kind of set piece of an Ottoman city. So what he also wanted to do was extend the area to make it look as though lots of other Christian and Jewish religious buildings were a part of it, to really emphasize this idea of multi-denominational coexistence. Now the plan didn't get fully implemented, but there was a renovation project and open spaces were created, and there is a sense of being in that area, of having this kind of really genuine and authentic Ottoman set piece, and there's a sense of it including other religious buildings as well. And you saw that how close this Serbian Orthodox Church was to the mosque, to the various structures of the city. So this became a sort of a tourist attraction that was important to this ideal of socialist Yugoslavia. It also became important in the 1990s because in the 1990s when Yugoslavia was dissolving, both the Serb and the Croat nationalists in Serbia and Croatia proper, they started to claim Bosnian Muslims as part of their own nations. And they did this in order to, they sort of felt, well, you're not really, your own separate nationality, because under Yugoslavia, Muslims were given their own nationality. They said, you're not really, your own nationality, you don't really deserve your own country. So Bosnian Muslims, who were now calling themselves Bosniaks, they used this Ottoman heritage as a way of protecting themselves against this encroachment. So the Ottoman heritage was then put into, was really used as a way of emphasizing the difference of Bosnia, of emphasizing its separateness, of emphasizing its independence, if you like. So that's another way in which the heritage became important. So you see various images here. And one other thing I wanted to point out was in post-independence Bosnia, the street signage, if you look at this, you'll see Maršale Tita, which is named after Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia. All the street signs were given this kind of renovation, and they were all used, they all used this sort of green backdrop, which is quite common throughout the city, but it's specifically connected to the Ottoman religious buildings and the idea of green being a colour of Islam and of being part of the, well, I think it comes originally from the Ottoman Caliphate flag, and this green sort of connects, it's part of the visual identity of the city, if you like. So you'll also see it on death notices that are on trees. So this is a Muslim death notice here that's sort of strapped to a tree or sellotaped to a tree. Now I'm not sure, does this happen in Turkey as well? Because I also see Serbian and Croatian death notices in Sarajevo.
It's very much Balkan.
It's a very Balkan thing. So this use of green to identify it as Muslim is quite interesting. And you see this throughout all these street signs, but they also evoke, the names of the streets themselves also evoke Muslim Bosniak history as well. But what's interesting, I would like to, just looking at these signs, they're not in any way neutral signs. I've done a little bit of research on Brussels and how Brussels uses street signs to create a neutral environment amongst Flemish and French speakers. But in Sarajevo, I look at these signs and think these aren't really neutral signs. They're not something that tries to bring together communities in a particular way. They're all in the Latin alphabet, so they're very particularly Bosniak or part of the Bosnian Croat Federation entity. If you go to the other entity, the Republika Srpska, you'll notice that the signs are in Cyrillic. So there's a kind of standoff between these street signs, and I'd just be interested in knowing how, to continue the research by looking at this idea of place telling, asking the residents of the streets to comment on the signs and seeing if there were different ideas between Bosnian Serb and Bosnian Croat, Bosnian Muslim residents and how they reacted to this signage policy. Now, Bosnia was also kind of, if we think back to that idea of it being, you know, the Yugoslav government wanting to use Bosnia as a set piece for multiculturalism, Bosnia is also the kind of heartland of Yugo nostalgia, because there's a lot of, you know, the idea of a multi-faith country kind of worked best within the environment of Sarajevo, where lots and lots of groups were living together. It wasn't so much the case in Belgrade or Zagreb, where it was much more homogenous in terms of nationality. So I visited this cafe in Sarajevo, which was kind of a shrine to Tito. And Sarajevo is the only major city in former Yugoslavia that still has its main street named after Marshal Tito. So that's quite interesting as well. Just moving on to language issues. It's quite interesting because Turkish has had an effect on the language across the entire former Yugoslavia. So in Serbian, in Croatian, also in Bosnian, Montenegrin, you'll get words that are of Turkish origin. So here's non-stop burek, and burek is like one of the mainstays of my traveling diet. So I just wanted to say that, you know, you get Turkish words in all of these situations, but here we have, in Bosnia, Turkish is used in quite an interesting way. Words of Turkish origin are really they're much more frequent in the Bosnian version of the language. And for example, in this example, the famous novel by Ivo Andrić, he uses the word çukrija from the Turkish köprü to identify the word bridge. So there's the word most, which is the Slavic word, but çukrija is a Turkish derived word. And it really refers to a bridge, a stone bridge with arches, so the kind of bridge you might know well from Mostar. And really what I'm trying to say is that it really identifies the Ottoman heritage and it celebrates it, it emphasizes it. The language in Bosnia is flavored by this encounter with Turkish, and it's celebrated in a way. So you also get, for example...
Or can I say, just,
yep.
Can I show off?
Yeah, go on.
Two things. 1962 Nobel Prize, I read in the paper coming here, Nobel Literature Prize was given. So that was 1962 Nobel Prize. It begins, Ladrini Chuprija, begins with great detail impaling of a Serbian nationalist by a Turkish pasha.
Oh, so we've got some more impaling.
It begins with impaling, so, connecting with the Vlad the Impaler.
Okay, very good. So we've got a rather nasty side to the whole thing. I was trying to suggest that it was a very, you know, because in Bosnia the use of Turkish is sometimes there to give a sense of warmth, a kind of local flavour. And maybe sometimes also in a more negative way to a sense of provincialism as well. But there are other words, for example, chef from heath, which I've seen translated as the choice to enjoy life without hurrying, this word is known all over the former Yugoslavia in all forms of the language, but it's particularly associated with Bosnia. And I was reading there's an interesting book by Fran Markovic about Sarajevo, and she identifies this idea of the šetanje as a kind of leisurely stroll through the streets of Sarajevo that everybody of all denominations takes part in every evening. Obviously it was interrupted by the war, but it started again after the war, soon after the war, and it's a sense that she identifies it as in Bosnia just by walking through the streets. It's like a passeggiata, but it's also an expression of coexistence and of all groups joining together in this kind of act of sort of pedestrian solidarity with each other. So that's also got maybe a link to this idea of chef. Okay. So, sorry, I went on too long there.
So we're just having a timing discussion.
I'll just summarize. So I'll just continue, and then we'll show the clip afterwards. I just wanted to really finish with this idea of Bucharest and how place identities in Bucharest are also influenced by this contact with Turkey and with the Ottomans, but in a very different way to in Sarajevo. So whereas in Sarajevo this connection with Turkey is celebrated for political reasons, maybe to separate it from the other republics of former Yugoslavia, give it its own identity. In Bucharest, there was a process of de-Ottomanization, so it was very much rejected, and any trace of Ottomanism was eradicated from the city. So Bucharest itself isn't really an Ottoman town. There was never, for example, there weren't Muslims living there was no mosque, and the city was in Wallachia, which was kind of it had some autonomy, but in many ways the city was very much, it was brought into the Ottoman Empire with a degree of autonomy, but in many ways the city shows the influence of Ottoman contact quite readily. So for example, as it was growing up in the 1400s, 1500s, it really followed Ottoman patterns, so there was no center specifically. There was no bazaar, but there was this thing called the Handele, which is kind of a trading center where traders could find accommodation as well. And there were things called mahallas, which were little areas around a church, which followed the Ottoman pattern of cities. So they were little areas of homogeneous communities based around a church or a synagogue. So in many ways it follows that Ottoman pattern, but from the 1830s onwards, as the Ottomans retreated from the Romanian lands, and as Romania got more and more independence, Romania really followed a policy of eradicating any trace of this Ottoman influence. So, and really it followed a French pattern. So this is quite obvious. If you know Bucharest, you can see Bucharest has an Arc de Triomphe, which is called the Arc de Triomphe, and this is the Gare du Nord, which really, if you think about those words, you can see the influence of French, both on the language and on the ideas of the language. So part of this is from the Transylvanian school, which was a Latinist school, which tried to replace any aspect of foreign words, if you like, with words from Latin languages, particularly French. And the Transylvanian school tried to really purge the language of Turkish influence and of Slavic influence as much as it could. And in doing so, it really made 40% of the whole language, the whole word stock, into French words. So why did Romania have this attraction with France? It was based on Romanian being a Latin language, but it was also a kind of retraction from Ottomanism and from the Ottoman Empire. It saw the West, Western Europe, as a model of modernity, and it tried to hide its Ottoman past, like a shameful secret in a way. And you can see this love of French in the street signage as well. So as French architects started to develop the city, create boulevards, create piazzas on the model of Paris, there was a sort of Haussmannization that went on that sort of met its ultimate end in Ceausescu's mega Haussmannization of the city under communism. As that process accelerated, Bucharest became known as the Micul Paris, the Little Paris. And if you look at the street signs that were created after communism, you'll see that they are directly derived from the French or the Parisian street signs of the 19th century under the prefect Rambuteau. So Romania is not the only former Ottoman territory to use Parisian street signs. You also get the same thing in Tunis. For kind of slightly different reasons. But if you walk through Bucharest, you will notice that it has a French-style architecture lots of the architects came directly from France, whereas in cities like Athens and Belgrade, it was German and Austrian architects who were used to really create them as capital cities. This love of France was really to do with creating this sense of identity that was not Ottoman. And this is also, as I said, in the language. So the words, there are a lot of words in Romanian that are of Turkish origin. So there's words like ciorba for soup. What was the word I said for cupboard? Dulap is cupboard. Things like that. But then there's other interesting examples where this kind of retreat from Turkish and from the Ottoman Empire is made clear. So there's the word Maidan, which used to mean a public square, and now it means an area of waste ground. And the word Mahala, which meant neighborhood, was replaced by quartier from the French, and now Mahala means a neighborhood that you wouldn't want to frequent. And it's beautiful in Bucharest, I would say, particularly this street here, which is under sort of severe renovation when I was there. So really what I wanted to say was that there's a difference in the different parts of the Balkans in terms of its contact with the Ottomans and in terms of how this contact with Turkey and with the Ottoman Empire is part of creating a national identity and creating national myths. So in Bosnia and in Romania, they're going in quite different directions. And it's interesting to see how that's done. I mean, in Greece, it was by reconnecting with the classical past. In Romania, it's with sort of like looking at its Latinist roots and reconnecting with France as a model. Whereas in Sarajevo, you've got this kind of celebration of the Ottoman Empire and a kind of rapprochement with Turkey, also for political reasons. So I'll leave it there, and I think we've got one last video to look at if we have time.
Thanks very much. We do have one last video, but I realise we're grossly over time, so I can show you just a little part of it so we can round up, and then maybe if I ask Mike just to kind of respond to that. And then we're basically cutting out a little section. I apologise, I've been a little bit too ambitious about what I thought we could include in this session. So we'll just maybe play another short clip and then we'll finish with Mike, if you'll bear with us.
People are interested only to know what was happening in the palace. The fine arts, the music, the poetry, oh, I love it. The costumes are very well nice, the jewelry is beautiful, the miniatures also, but it wasn't all. Ottoman Empire had its ups and downs, and it had huge sufferings as well.
The actor in the lead role of Sultan Suleiman welcomes the debate.
People started to read history, then they started to discuss about history, and they are trying to learn what's right and what's wrong, and discussing. So this is good for the future, very promising, because you know, if you know your history, then you can build your future in a healthy way.
I think the resurgence of this interest in the Ottoman Empire today is both positive and also negative. Religious extremism has given us this image of Islam as intolerant. So the Ottoman Empire is a very good example of tolerant Islam for a very long time. On the other hand, the end of the Ottoman Empire was horrendous, where massacres happened, where populations were eliminated.
Every Turk today has a vision of the Ottoman Empire. And if you just ask a Turk, what do you think about the Ottoman Empire, you'll get an answer, and that answer will tell you what political camp that Turk is probably in. conservatives generally identify with the Ottoman Empire, praise it as their model, as the source of their heritage, whereas more secularist Turks look at the empire as somewhat corrupt.
So that was part of a section of the final part of the series, really, where we were looking at the contemporary interest, and particularly what in English is the TV series Magnificent Century, and how that's become both phenomenally popular in terms of having a big audience, but also controversial in the sense that it's divided people. And I hope that in terms of how the discussion of the sort of opulence of the way that it's depicted sort of captures both some of what we've talked about today, but also some of how that evokes these earlier kind of meanings. And it was fascinating for the crew to spend time with the crew that had made that, the director and the writers, and to see how they felt pleased that through doing the series, they had at least been some small part of discussing a history that perhaps had previously been less easy to discuss.
Thank you very much for summarising that so eloquently and concisely. We've run 15 minutes over time, I apologise. I hope it's a good starting point for the rest of the day. I don't think we have time for questions or commentary just now, but please, approach us during the rest of the day. Those of you that are interested, we can show you one more clip that we didn't actually have time to show you, so perhaps we can show it to you later on. Thank you very much for your patience, and I'd like to pass over to Dana to continue the rest of the programme.
I think that really was an excellent start and certainly a lot of food for thought. So thank you, Emma, Warren and Mike, for that. It's extremely stimulating. I think the word that I'd like to take away from that is, if I pronounce it correctly, cheer. So what I suggest is we're going to enjoy life without hurrying. But, we have a very brief sort of 10-minute comfort break for about I think there's some coffee at the back, and we reconvene at midday, and we'll move on with the session and move on to something I think rather different. So we've just got 5 or 10 minutes just for a quick cup of coffee and turn our backs around.
The term meander also is Anatolian.
Meander, okay, so we're meandering as well.
First session was very colorful, lots of pictures. I really enjoyed it. Now we took, now the depressing part is coming along. One political scientist, one historian, and then dark and brooding Turkish style, heavy history. So we'll try to also entertain you, don't worry. Let me start by welcoming Professor Bülent Gökay for kindly accepting our invitation. He just arrived from Kiel University. Those journeys in the UK sometimes take a long time, and arrived here on time. And what I'm going to do in this session is just provide the context, 15 to 20 minutes if I can, and then give the floor to Bülent. And I'm also looking forward to Bülent's views. And Bülent is a prolific writer, actually. He's written lots of books on Kosovo, Turkish-Russian relations, and then the book I really like, my favorite one is the Turkey between Russian Bolshevism and British imperialism. Is that right title? It's a brilliant, I would recommend, book if you want to understand that period of Turkish history. I'll also have some pictures, and let me start as a boring academic conceptual thing that you know where I'm coming from. This grand strategy, you might be wondering, is there this hidden agenda or something? This grand strategy is a geopolitical term. In a way, what's the grand strategic discourses? I teach foreign policy analysis from a critical geopolitical point of view, my approach to foreign policy analysis is much more reflective rather than rationalist, Eurocentric. So that means I take sort of cognitive factors into account in foreign policy making. Of course, they're not independent from material factors. So you can see in this, for instance, geopolitical traditions matter, history, geopolitics, political economy in a way provides the infrastructure for. Sorry, no. Can you go back, please? Okay, and then this reflects on the foreign policy practices and institutions, diplomatic statecraft, experts, strategic institutions, think tank, they all pay lip service to this almost grand strategy, the discursive practices. So, foreign policy, teaching foreign policy with national characteristics, for instance, to compare, one of the concepts I'm obsessed with is exceptionalist discourses, like for instance, when you look at Russian foreign policy and then listen to Putin's post-Crimea speech, you just keep coming across this concept, Russian honor, and Brzezinski, this Eurasianist, in a way, underlying ideology. In American exceptionalism, when you listen to Obama's speech, it says, we Americans are exceptional people. And then in China, again, the 100 years of humiliation, the post-colonial anti-imperialist rhetoric. And then, you just see this. And I don't have a brilliant, if you ask me what I mean by exceptionalism, I think there is a brilliant quote by Freud. He talks about narcissism of the mind and difference. Just to give you one example, a concrete example, our president, for instance, said, the Muslims do not commit genocide. So that's kind of narcissism of the mind and difference. When the Sudanese president, as he was accused of genocide and visiting Turkey, he said, oh, of course I will accept it. Muslims never commit genocide. So as I said, I'm a political scientist, but I'm not sure about the scientist because my approach is much more reflectivist than rationalist. So let me start a bit. I'm sure you all are familiar, the pan-ideologies, because ideologies also matter. If you go back to the Ottoman times, one of the obsessions, particularly in the 19th century, if you take out the sick men of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, one of the preoccupations of the rulers, sultans and intellectuals was how to stop the decline of Ottoman Empire. The decline in empire, how to find a solution to this. The three ideologies came out of this, and still, in fact, these ideologies, in a way, cluster ideologies I call, have an influence in Turkish foreign policy thinkers, intellectuals still discuss this. The first period, as you know, pan-Ottomanism, that the Ottomans tried to find solutions by imitating the West. Why we are being defeated, maybe we are not any more militarily superior than adopting the Western institutions, the Tanzimat period, Gülhane. So this is the first. And then the second, this didn't work out. The second period started with Abdülhamid, the pan-Islamism, because the Balkan lands and other Christian territories have been lost. Abdülhamid tried to keep the Ottoman Empire by resorting to this pan-Islamist discourse. And then it comes the third period. Again, you'll find this in Bülent's book as well. And this, when you look at the Ottoman historians, they really, this 19th century is this great, it's a final end of the beginning of an end, so for the Ottoman. And the final, the Pan-Turkism. Pan-Turkism became an ideology with union and progress, İttihat ve Terakki, and then, and then the Tatar intellectuals, like Ismail Gabrinsky, Asparal Ismail, and Üç Tarzı Siyaset, what was the name of that type? Yusuf Akçura, and then almost often these ideas came from Tatar Turks from Crimea. Ziya Gökalp, he himself was Kurdish but created this pan-Turkish ideology. Again, Tekin Alp was a Jewish Ottoman Jew, again wrote about how superior the Turkish race was, even though he was. So you can see these ideologies still matter. But Kemalism, in a way, at that moment, you know, at the end of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire just disintegrated, and it was understood that it was almost impossible to save it. A dark horse emerges. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm wrong or right. Kemal Atatürk was relatively insignificant actor during the Ottoman period, you know, compared with Ittihadi's other pashas. But what happens that in the self-perception of the Turkish national movement emerged in the fight against Western domination, I'd like to really, if Bülent allows me, quote this brilliant phrase that it explains the Kemalist era really well. It says, the central motivation of the Kemalist movement stemmed from the fact that the ultimate survival of the Muslim Turks from the Western domination could be achieved by a clear denunciation of the Ottoman heritage and lands, and ultimately by being incorporated into the Western system of values. Just to summarize, I'm not going to go into this. This was a top-down modernization. And of course, nobody suggests that Ottoman, you know, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was a Democrat. At that time in Europe, there were many Democrats. When you look at the other countries, it was mainly driven by, if you like, military, bureaucrat, historical hegemonic class. And the Westernization was, in fact, it was a defensive Westernization, even though it was sort of presented as, oh, we have gained our independence from imperial powers as an imperial power. But again, our way, the nation-state model was adopted. I mean, even if you look at that kind of the legislative, judicial, institutional aspects, all borrowed, you know, the Swiss civil law, Italian criminal law, French constitutionalism and all that, so borrowed. So this is a sweeping I've just given. And then at the end of the Cold War, at the end of the Second World War, declaration of the Truman Doctrine, Marshall Aid, and Turkey becomes a multi-party democracy. And, you know, there is a lot of debate about, you know, at the moment, what's happening in the Middle East, the Turkish model. What is Turkish model? In fact, it's more sensible to speak about models, because Turkey has always been a model since the beginning of the Republic. For instance, at the end of the Second World War, when the Democrat Party comes to power, Celal Bayar talks about Turkey as a model. Little America, he says, we are going to turn Turkey into Little America. And then, you know, there are many examples of this. I'm not going to go into this. At the end of the Cold War, Süleyman Demirel, when he was a president, says 21st century was going to be a Turkic century, because then the Central Asian dimension, and then Ismail Cem, the predecessor of the Davutoğlu, also started zero problem. You think now it's Davutoğlu, zero problems. In fact, started with Ismail Cem as a foreign minister, and started with Greece. And for the first time, also Turkish diplomats and politicians started to take Middle East very seriously, because the Middle East itself was undergoing transformation. So, more or less, this grand strategy of Westernization carried on, survived, sustained in a way, and all other strategies, foreign policy strategies, were subordinated to this Europeanization and Westernization policies. But things started to change in the beginning of 2000s. In 2002, as you know, Justice and Development Party, AKP, comes to power. The AKP came to power in a way as a result of the deepest economic crisis in 2001, corruption scandals and all that. Those developments in a way brought the Islamic AKP was formed as the party itself calls itself AK Party. You know, AK means white and clean. AK Party, and founded, but actually it goes back this as an ideology. There's an ideological continuity here that is started with. It stemmed from the Milli Görüş movement created in the 1960s, And of course there are differences. I'm not generalizing when something, so it's not a new thing. The party itself new, but the ideology of the party is not new, even though it was modified, transformed, so on and so forth. It proved that in 1980, for instance, so if you look at the background, the rise of AKP was due to several factors. For instance, the military willing to tolerate any form of socialist, Marxist, and leftist ideologies, used Islam as an antidote to the Soviet-inspired communism, so on and so forth. I mean, when, for instance, Kenan Evren, the head of the military, came to power, he used to have these speeches in the squares and made references to Quran and all that stuff. And when some of us were in prison, for instance, even in prisons, that people were forcefully, they were forced to pray, attend these sermons and everything, political prisons, the Marxists and everything. So you can see there's this binary thinking that the military was against Islam today. There's secularists versus Islam is a kind of very distorted one because it's not that clear cut. So the AKP's ideology in a way gradually evolved. 3 terms. The first term, actually I remember talking to Brent when they came to power over the phone, and we were excited. Maybe there's democratization now, maybe things are going to change, maybe the military can be pushed back and there's popular support. And there were lots of reforms in the first period from 2001 to 2007. And the AKP also effectively used the European Union in a way to restrain the army, to push the army to the back, to the background. And effectively used. Then the second term came to actually relations run into difficulty, also other problems, and the third era, again I'm not going to go into the details, we can discuss later, and Erdogan declared the third era, this is the era of AKP's mastery period, he just addresses people, from the balconies, his balcony speeches, he says, now this is the beginning of the mastery. So, the core ideology actually is not directly challenged. The core ideology of the state, the Turkish Islamic synthesis, is not directly challenged but modified according to the Islamic agenda. The ownership of the state as a hegemonic apparatus changed hands, but the ideology still is there. So there is a very useful term here, some say AKP revolution, but it's the kind of passive revolution, the gradual, in fact, incorporation, consolidation of AKP through the state structures. In a way, AKP has been very, very successful in manufacturing the consent of the Turkish people, and loyal supporters, so on and so forth. But in this period, if the first period AKP used the European Union effectively, and in its last period, the government even pays lip services to European membership, so on and so forth. I don't think it's on top of Turkish agenda. So, to summarize, if the Republican Kemalist ideology is based on the denial of the break from the Ottoman past, the AKP, Justice and Development Party, actually started to construct this Ottomanist past as a paradigm lost. Because we had sick man of Europe. I'm actually product of this Republican. I'm a graduate of Faculty of Political Science, which was established in Istanbul in 1859 in the Ottoman Palace, Public Administration School. Atatürk carries to Ankara, and then to create a Republican elite, governors, diplomats. I graduated from that school. Then I learned the Ottoman Empire from Enver Ortaylı, Taner Timur, Halil Berktay, and many others. We discussed the Ottoman Empire. We really, there is this kind of now emergence of always, almost, when you even watch these recent programs about Ottoman nostalgia, retrospective thinking, retrospective analysis that almost the collapse of the empire was inevitable, the birth of the Turkish Republic was inevitable. And instead of analyzing it in its own context, objectively, if you have this retrospective, some say teleological, this the purpose, then almost the neo-Ottomanism was inevitable that was going to come at the fore. Even when you listen to speeches, for instance, Davutoğlu, sometimes Erdogan, they talk about emerging from the ashes, like inevitability of this Turkish Republic, and then transformation, and then in a way, exercising the Ottoman. But if you go to the next slide, please, you can see, even though Erdogan is in the limelight, press and everything, and he's the main leader, and drives the economic policies as a prime minister, also was an important figure. The grand strategist of Turkish foreign policy is Davutoğlu. And if you ask who Davutoğlu is, Davutoğlu was born in Konya, a conservative, in a small town in Konya, a conservative background, wealthy, kind of provincial businessman, and Istanbul, comes and then attends this German high school, and then goes from there to Middlesex University, graduates, and then he was the chief advisor to the prime minister after the elections, and in 2009 he became the foreign minister, and as you know, recently, unanimously and unilaterally, he was appointed, I wouldn't say elected, by Erdogan himself as the prime minister of Turkey. This is not a coincidence, so I'd like to focus a bit more, because he's the influential figure. He's also a professor of international relations. He spent a term also in Malaysia's Department of International Relations. At one point, actually, even between 1998 and 2002, he was a visiting lecturer at the military academy. He gave lectures to the soldiers and generals, and so a prolific writer. If you go back, can you just go a bit further, please? For instance, he says, let's establish Ottoman nations of commonwealth. Yeah, and then if you move, next slide, please. Again. Okay, this is the book, the most popular book. I think this is the 61st edition, but I think it's now running this 91th series. So almost like Mao's Red Book. You just go to Turkey, everybody reads it. Everybody reads it and shows the book to you. Even my auntie said, have you read Strategic Depth? You are international relations. I said, he said, this book is actually, Davutoğlu is a great, in a classical sense, geopolitician. Speciality really matters to him. And then, for instance, he said, mekanı anlamadan siyasal düzeni anlamak mümkün değildir. If I can translate, without understanding the speciality of the space, we cannot understand, in a way, geopolitical orders. So speciality, speciality is the key thing in his thinking. I'm sure we are all, this is the common theme, the space, how the present, imagine spaces. So the key theme of the book, what he means by depth. Depth, two things, the historical depth, the Ottoman past, and then the second one is the geopolitical. He thinks that this is not fully explored. Turkey is geopolitically important, it's geopolitically important thing, has always been there anyway, NATO membership, European Union, it always pops up. Turkey is geopolitically and strategically the key country. It's interesting actually, where I visit lots of countries around the Black Sea, they all say Ukraine is the most geopolitically, the most important central country. When you read this book, you come across that certain things, highly eclectic, didactic book, and there are references to sort of classical geopoliticians, Haushofer, Mark Mahan, if you're not familiar, like the sea, Anglo-American, and all those geopolitical, classical geopoliticians, some of them inspired Nazis, for instance, Haushofer. And then he refers to Haushofer and says that if you move to the next, this is a kind of map It just says that there's a hinterland, Balkans, the Middle East, and the Caucasus, that these are the sort of places that Turkey has historical continuity. There are 4 seas that Turkey needs to have presence, like Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Arabian Sea, and beyond there are also the continental basins that Turkey has to extend its influence. So historical depth and geopolitical significance. And also he just comes up with some key terms, like for instance Turkey, you know this bridge thing. Turkey is a bridge between Asia and Europe, and then when you cross the Bosphorus Strait, you know, it says Europe, welcome to Europe, welcome to Asia. So he says Turkey is not a bridge. Turkey is a center country, has to play a central role. And then another thing, energy hub, for instance, the pipelines have to go through the straits and everything. I just call this that trying to kind of create a pipeline state. All the pipelines go through Turkey, things flow through Turkey. All this, lots of eclectic kind of, is inspired by, when you look at it almost, because I teach geopolitics, there's kind of influence of German romantic idealism, pan-Germanism, and then Anglo-American pragmatism, and then the Ottoman nostalgia, what do you call them? Potpourri? Is it potpourri? I think it's kind of potpourri. There's no really clear, cohesive argument there. And also there are references to Ibn Khaldun and all that. But if you really want to understand his thinking, I mean, for instance, he also uses Hayat alanı, which can be translated Lebensraum, living space, you know, German. He also refers to this kind of thing. So you might say Turkey's Henry Kissinger. Really, Turkey needed one, and we have now Turkish Henry Kissinger. He's well known. This is a very well known work. But if we go back, he's written a book in 1993. His PhD thesis, Alternative Paradigms: The Impact of Islamic and Western Wealth and Charms on Political Theory, and wrote another one, Civilizational Transformation. So when you look at it, you know, also he loves Huntington, you know, Clash of Civilizations, and he falls into the same trap where Huntington falls, and then he treats civilizations as monolithic, kind of homogenic entities, you know, and then he says, for instance, conflicts and contrasts between Western and Islamic political thought originate mainly from their philosophical, methodological, and theoretical background rather than from mere institutional and historical differences. And he says that the Islamic world and the West, that the interests are irreconcilable. So distinctive, but the way he treats even Islam as a sort of one single block, and also he mixes, for instance, what's civilization, culture, these are completely different things, that there's a kind of confusion about these things. It's a civilizational geopolitics as well. So what I would say, I think Davutoğlu is a reverse Huntingtonian, you know, reverse Huntington. If Huntington is an Orientalist, Davutoğlu really is an excellent, he sounds like an Occidentalist, even the way he treats the West like a one single unit, like all the Westerners think in this way, the Enlightenment tradition. It's much more complicated than that. So, but there are two actually things stand out when you read the discursive kind of underline when you seek for those. One is the ontological quest. He's trying to carve this kind of authentic identity, you know, but it's not really authentic because the sources are still very dominant. They're dominated by the Western geopolitical thinking and all that. He almost looks in the mirror of the West and tries to understand himself in the mirror of the West rather than, you know, he selectively sort of quotes some Turkish sources. In fact, this really portrays his, in a way, educational background, a bit of German education, a bit of Anglo-American education, a bit of Islamic scholarship. So it's just kind of eclectic and highly mixed. So, but ontological quest is one of these, the other one is the epistemological break with the Eurocentric modernity. They're saying the modernity is not necessarily a European phenomenon. So there are also other modernities, forms of modernity, so on and so forth. So it's a kind of false authenticity, if you like, not the real one. So, I also would like to talk, if you go back, so if you go a bit further, let me see. Yes, this is the book. It's very sort of difficult to obtain this book. And then if you go to the next one, please. But you know, when we talk about this fastest growing economy, when we look at the nature of Turkish economy actually runs on huge infrastructure projects. You know, almost on a daily basis, Erdogan comes up with another crazy, he calls this crazy project, mega projects. Third Bosphorus Bridge, third airport in the north of Istanbul, second canal, and parallel to the Bosphorus Bridge, huge. So, of course, this is the kind of, if you like, this is what drives the economy, these mega projects. And the shopping malls, mosques, all sorts of things are appearing all over the place. But his understanding, even if you judge even AKP's economic model from an Ottoman point of view, it's nothing to do with Ottomanism. One sociologist called this brilliantly, I like it. He says, retro-developmentalist neoliberal model. And his privatization of these spaces, shopping centers, and you know, the Gezi uprising was all about that. In fact, when you read the Ottoman history, I learned from the Ottomanists that the Ottoman state was the owner of the whole land, you know, and then these public spaces, Ottomans were very careful. They were not, you know, they couldn't be transferred into the private hands. So the wakfs, you know, foundations and all that stuff. But AKP and his business people, elite, are too happy to privatize public assets, displacing the inhabitants of shanty towns, to make the land available to developers, selling public land in Istanbul to construction firms, so on and so forth. So even the economic model itself is nothing to do with Ottoman, if you like, ideology or whatever, you know. Ottoman, it was a completely different thing. That was one of the reasons that Ottomans couldn't understand the requirements of the globalization because of this, and that's why it collapsed. You know, the economic collapse was due to that, because globalization is about the privatization, commercialization, and all those things. So, if you go a bit more, I want to quickly show. This is Taksim Square. There's the Gezi Park. If you go again, next one, and this is what he wanted to build. And if you go, if it's next one, you can see there's a mosque and a huge building. It's also destroying the skyline of Istanbul, even though, you know, if you respect the Ottoman Empire, then maybe, I don't know, is there anything Ottoman about this? None at all. So, next one. And this was the sort of, he wanted to build a mosque in Taksim. I call this Disneyland Ottomanism. You know, what's Ottoman about this mosque? I mean, really, this is not, I don't know. This was the big project. So, the Gezi, if you go, you know, the next one, and this is the pipeline, the energy minister is signing this new TANAP project, bringing oil from Azerbaijan to Europe. Next one. Now, I'd like to talk a bit, you know, model. If we are going to talk about the model, for me, the real model is Gezi, Taksim, the protest in Taksim, in many ways. And then Gündüz is a performance artist himself, started the Standing Man protests. He started his protest at 5 o'clock in the evening. And you can see more and more people joining in and standing and staring. And then the next one. And then they started standing in the streets, they spread to other cities, not only Istanbul, people are standing, reading things and protesting. The next one. And this is so funny. Even some those joining. So this was, in a way, I call this another key concept in my research is liminality. If you look at the nature of, there's this tendency to see all the secularists against Islamists. I mean, if you look at the people who participated in these protests, there were anti-capitalist Muslims, if you go a bit more. Yeah, the women had scout and none had scout, and protesting side by side, environmentalists, Alawites and all that. So it's not that clear-cut that the secularists were versus Islamists. It's much more liminal in between. I mean, when Erdem Gündüz was interviewed, he says, why is this? What were you doing? Standing. He says, I was standing and looking at the symbols of the Republic. This is what I was doing. In a way, this is a really telling story because he's there, standing on the threshold of a new, or in between. This is a Taksim Square between private and public, between secularism and religious, if you like, religiosity, between markets, between, so they just say, they're an apolitical nation. Okay, there's no clear ideology, there's no party, there's no leadership, but this is a kind of liminal generation in between, and they're protesting. And they're saying that democracy is not about majoritarianism, but democracy is also participatory democracy. We are here to say something. And it's very difficult to categorize these people and these protesters. I mean, at the moment there are other protests going on. I think this is the new Turkey. This Gezi is the Turkey of the future. After Gezi, actually, AKP and its government looks new old Turkey, the continuation of the new old Turkey. Again, when you listen to President Erdogan and from Prime Minister Erdogan's speeches, he always talks in the first singular. My country, my people, my state, my bridge, my projects, my son. So he just says, I really know, I'd like to end this with the great Turkish sociologist Şerif Mardin says, at the bosom of every Turk, there are two souls. It contains two souls, macho and Sufi. And the macho is sitting over there, Mehmet, I am the Sufi. So, Sufi and macho. And Atatürk got rid of Sufi, he says, and then we had to cope with macho. And then Sufi has arrived and gone quickly. Okay, now we have to cope with another macho. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tunç. I'm sorry to tell you that mine probably will be much more boring for most of you, because rather than going to sociological and cultural imagination, I will bring you back to crude reality of today's foreign policy, especially in the debates between Syria, Turkey, and the region. When I was asked to come and talk here, the situation wasn't as grim as it is today. Maybe it was still tragic and grim for many people living in Syria and Iraq. But in terms of implications for Turkey, something like 6 weeks ago when I was asked, the situation wasn't as obvious as it is today. Now we have an unpredicted result which is affecting internal peace in Turkey, which is direct consequence of Turkey's foreign policy adventures or some miscalculations of the last 10-12 years, which I'm going to concentrate and give to you, to touch many of the aspects, or in a way provide a very colorful potpourri about AKP and Turkish history and politics. I am going to try to give you my argument, my thesis on how to interpret AKP period's foreign policy. What is different, or if there is something different, what is the new term, what is the so-called grand strategy in terms of Ahmet Davutoğlu's foreign policy practice. The basic principles that guided Turkey's foreign policy since the foundation of the Republic in 1923 were caution and pragmatism. The lessons emerged from the way the Ottoman Empire ended at the end of the First World War forced the leaders of the young Turkish Republic to be very cautious. They saw that there was very little to gain and much to lose from entering into the unfriendly and unpredictable conflicts in the region. And for most of the period, until the last 10-12 years, Turkish foreign policy was almost always cautious and nearly reactionary to the events happening within its close neighborhood. And when Turkey acted in a much more proactive way, it was almost always within the boundaries of Western security arrangements after the leadership of NATO and United States. In the past decade, however, Turkish foreign policy appeared to have undergone an important transformation, putting Turkey in the map of nations as a relatively more influential actor. In this recent change towards a more active, even proactive foreign policy, most of the credit has been given, both in Turkey and abroad, to Ahmet Davutoğlu, Turkey's foreign minister from 2009 to last month, and currently Tayyip Erdogan's chosen prime minister. Davutoğlu had previously served as chief advisor to both prime minister and the foreign minister from the beginning of the AKP period, 2002. And he was considered by many the architect of Turkey's new foreign policy activism. A policy which came to be known as zero problems with neighbors has been the centerpiece of Davutoğlu's so-called new foreign policy agenda. This policy was welcomed widely in Turkey and in the region and in the West until very recently. Accordingly, Ankara first developed relations with Syrian government to the level of a strategic partnership. Also, closer economic and political ties were established with Iran and Russia. Davutoğlu's long-term aim was explained in his masterpiece, as Tunç explained, Strategic Debt, as making Turkey a central player in world politics within a stable regional environment and a pluralist international world order. Strategic Debt calls for an active engagement with all regional systems in Turkey's neighborhood, namely the Balkans, the Middle East, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Based on Turkey's geostrategic position, its size and its history, Davutoğlu argues that Turkey should act as a central state in all these regions and become a global actor as a result. So this was the simple logic of what Davutoğlu has been writing, talking, and claiming that he was trying to put into practice. His formulation of principles and mechanisms of foreign policy provided him with recognition, as I said, internationally as a man of vision in shaping Turkey's foreign affairs. Even though Davutoğlu managed to pronounce the new, more active foreign policy and sharply increase new confidence in foreign affairs more explicitly and in detail and analytically, and as Tunç said, most probably because of his academic background, the change in Turkey's foreign relations had started long before Davutoğlu appeared in the picture, even before the AKP government came to power in 2002. In real fact, building regional influence of the type to which Davutoğlu aspires is a long process that takes place gradually and incrementally over decades, and obviously not just as an immediate result of Davutoğlu's so-called new vision and hyperactive diplomacy. One can identify certain building blocks put in place under Turgut Özal leadership from 1983 to 1993, and also under Ismail Cem's long career as the country's foreign minister from 1992 and 2002. But more than anything else, all this new activism and increased confidence could only be possible within a significantly changed region. And I think this is something I focus my argument more than anything else. This changed regional and global environment. The end of the 1980s not only witnessed the end of the Cold War, but also the early indications of a global shift in power positions in the world, with very significant long-term consequences. happened around the same time. In the words of Joseph Nye, wealth and power started to be shifting from the West to the rising economies of the East. In a world of complex interdependence, this power shift has hugely significant consequences, even though it is still too early to clearly identify all consequences. In political economy terms, this is a shift from a unipolar system to a multipolar system. This was explained in 2010 in the pages of Foreign Affairs, very influential and close to American foreign policy making magazine, Foreign Affairs, in the following words. The dramatic growth of Brazil, China and India, and the emergence of middle-tier economies such as Indonesia and Turkey is transforming the geopolitical landscape and testing the institutional foundation of the post-Second World War liberal order. I think this is the key to understand at least the attempt, the intentions of this new hyperactive foreign policy or increased confidence in Turkey's policymakers. And you can see the same approach in other emerging powers, foreign affairs as well. The success of the so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India and China, and the MICT countries, Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea and Turkey, shows that the West is a former West and that the world is changing rapidly. It is no longer up to a handful of countries in the Northern Hemisphere to decide what the world looks like. The emerging countries are, however, by no means an undifferentiated mess. And also the progress, the pace of the progress is not a linear line. There are ups and downs. There are huge differences between the emerging economies, and these differences shape not only the pace of their progress, but also the way they locate themselves in the global map regarding recent conflicts. Turkey's economic growth has been extraordinary during the last 10 years by historic standards. As Europe's economy contracted, Turkey's economy has expanded to nearby regions. So it was this increased economic strength which made a more active and dynamic foreign policy possible. The significant trade and investment linkages between Turkey and the neighboring countries characterize this new foreign policy activism. Therefore, it should be recalled that the course of Turkish foreign policy directly followed the growth of Turkish economy and its increasing role and space in the world economic map. The way the policymakers responded to this also started long before Ahmet Davutoğlu, first with Turgut Özal and continued with Ismail Cem, and even under AKP government, it was first Tayyip Erdoğan and Abdullah Gül, two dominant leaders from 2002 onwards, who share some responsibility for steering Turkey into new waters of more active foreign policy activism. Probably the turning point in Turkey's foreign affairs came in 2003, when the Turkish parliament, to some extent unexpectedly, refused to allow the United States to use Turkish territory to stage an invasion of Iraq. In retrospect, this opting out of the invasion of Iraq came to constitute a transformation moment for Turkey. With that decision, Turkey demonstrated to its neighbors and to the world, and even to itself, that Turkey could and would think and act for itself when it comes to foreign policy, and that the hierarchical alliances of the Cold War period were over, and that the United States should no longer take Turkey's collaboration for granted. Yet the significance of this step shouldn't be exaggerated. It shouldn't be interpreted as a complete U-turn towards a new position. Many people translated this, interpreted this as a turn towards Islam and away from Western security arrangements, which I don't agree. This was a turning point, but not that significant. Even during the Iraq War, Turkish government allowed the Incirlik Air Base to be used by American combat aircraft for bombing missions. During the initial years of the AKP government, there was some success in achieving some of these goals Ahmet Davutoğlu explained in his book, which he claims contributed to peace and stability in the region. Turkey encouraged peace talks between Syria and Israel. Turkey also played or attempted to play a constructive role in the Balkans and the Caucasus as a peacemaker, bringing Bosnia and Serbia together, and taking some steps towards normalizing relations with Armenia. In a more ambitious way, Turkey collaborated with Brazil in May 2010 to persuade Iran to accept an arrangement for the storage of a large portion of Iran's enriched uranium in Turkey, and in this way providing a practical, peaceful and more sensible alternative to the sanctions and warmongering of the US-Israeli position against Iran. And even with Israel, Turkish leadership did its best in this early period to restore normalcy to the Turkish-Israeli relations. But then Turkey lost its way. First in Libya, then in Syria. Erdogan and Davutoğlu initially opposed UN sanctions on Gaddafi and rejected calls for NATO operations. They eventually approved NATO operations with some reservations and called for Gaddafi's resignation. The Libyan fiasco, however, was short-lived, at least for Turkish foreign policy, even if no less traumatic for the Libyan people. The situation in Syria proved much more complicated and difficult for Ankara to handle. Soon Turkey's Syria policy has become an unmitigated disaster, and Davutoğlu's nicely drafted analysis turned into a mess. Strategic debt turned into a great strategic disaster. In particular, Turkish Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan's quite aggressively taking sides with opposition forces against Assad government put Turkey in a very difficult position. Turkish authorities, as a result, provided the so-called rebels in Syria an unchecked and poorly overseen support base in Turkey. It provided space for the mobilization of the armed men crossing the border to kill Syrian soldiers and civilians, and backed the establishment of the Free Syrian Army and the so-called Syrian National Council. In this way, Turkey has effectively become a side in the bloody civil war in Syria. As long as the rebels can count on the unconditional support from Ankara, as well as from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, they could keep fighting a war that has become increasingly more brutal. In reality, the gap between so-called moderate Syrian opposition and Islamist extremism is much more limited than presented by Turkey's policymakers. As a whole, the Syrian crisis has exposed weaknesses in Davutoğlu's and Erdogan's initial claims of presenting Turkey as a significant regional player for peace and stability. So-called new term in Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East simply corresponded to joining a Sunni axis together with Qatar and Saudi Arabia, as opposed to the Shiite bloc led by Iran. Just over 2 years ago, Ahmet Davutoğlu had famously declared that Assad was about to fall in a matter of weeks. I was in Istanbul for a conference just around that time. It was about Turkish foreign policy in one of the universities. And Davutoğlu came to conference to make the opening speech. And at lunchtime, he asked me to go and sit at his table. I kind of criticized him when they were talking one-to-one, saying that, how do you know all that so-called Syrian opposition are reliable? Do you know who you are giving the weapons and training? And he said, look, don't worry, we know who they are, and we can control them. So more than 100 weeks passed since then. Assad did more than just holding his ground, and even gained the upper hand in certain sections of Syria in the civil war. And now we have the so-called Islamic State on Turkey's borders. In Syria, Turkey has become a prisoner of its enmity towards the Assad regime. Turkey is one of the countries with primary responsibility for the existence, growth, and spread of the Islamic State. Radical Islamic fighters have been used as proxy forces against Bashar al-Assad's regime. The Turkish state now faces a Frankenstein's monster. As the growth of IS in Syria and Iraq is increasingly considered by the Turkish authorities as a potential threat to its internal stability. And I think it's more than potential now if you look at the events in Turkey currently. Within such a charged situation, clashes between police and the activists in the Kurdish southeast of Turkey, and even in the west, in central, almost all over Turkey, is getting more and more frequent and damaging to internal peace in Turkey. So this is putting, once again, the credibility of the regime's foreign policy under serious strain. In a situation of increasing desperation and fears on the ground, repeated calls for the West and Turkey to intervene militarily in Syria are understandable. But the supposed humanitarian motivation of the outside powers, including Turkey, is just not convincing. The recent history is a good evidence of that. It is, of course, true that IS is a deeply reactionary force. But the US-led military strikes launched on IS targets, rather than assisting the Kurdish population and others in Syria, have only made the matters worse. Since the bombing started, more Islamist forces in Syria and in Iraq, they joined the ranks with IS. Now IS is presenting itself as the true anti-imperialist force of the Syrian and the whole Muslim people in the region. So in fact, the US-led interventions of the last 20 years are the basic reasons for the sectarian fighting in the region. So the most likely future is a prolonged civil war in both Iraq and Syria for the foreseeable future. To conclude this brief overview of Turkish foreign policy of the last 12 years, first point one can observe is that there are too many contradictions to claim that there is a clear new direction. In other words, a simple doctrine such as Davutoğlu's strategic bet cannot describe the direction of Turkish foreign policy as the policies put forward in practice do not correspond to a clear new direction, even though the official propaganda keeps making this claim. Many Turkish initiatives have been less well prepared, suggesting a top-heavy approach rather than serious and realistic planning. One observer recently described Davutoğlu's performance as foreign minister as naivety, romanticism, and refusal to consult and refusal to learn from his own mistakes. And I think this is quite accurate when you look at his practice. A second point to mention is that there has been a clear continuity in the foreign policy, at least since 1983, rather than a strong new direction under Davutoğlu, as claimed by many pro-AKP sources. And finally, the general direction of Turkey's foreign policy has changed very little geopolitically in this period. It has been Western-oriented and closely linked to the US interest in the region, as it always has been since the end of the Second World War. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bülent, for a much more sober and serious assessment of the situation. Because it's a long session, I don't know whether you have time for questions, and we're happy to answer them. If you have any questions, any contributions, interventions, clarifications, please do not hesitate, or anything sort of left unexplained. No questions? So you have a question, Mehmet? Or a comment? Are you directing? Ah, okay. Yeah. Peter, yeah. Are you directing at me? Yeah, okay, I'll give you an answer and pass the microphone to Bülent, because Bülent has particularly focused on that dimension. I had some media interviews yesterday in between, arranging time clashes, lectures and all that, with Voice of Russia, Evening Star, and then they were asking me. And I just actually used this phrase, and I'd like to repeat here, what sort of policy Turkey adopted. I called it deliberate strategic negligence. So I don't think Turkey will commit itself, and I think Turkey at the moment is happy to sit on its hands and not do anything about it, because when you look at the threat assessment, I think the main threat for Turkish government seems to me comes from the Kurdish, if you like, autonomous region in Syria, and they seem to sort of, okay, ISIS is a threat, but not an immediate one. The immediate threat one is also that spills over into Turkish politics. For the first time actually in Turkish history, we have this issue that the boundaries between the Middle East and Turkey has so blurred now. What's domestic, what's foreign policy is not clear. I mean, when I was at the Faculty of Political Science, we used to have these ambassadors telling us, please do not keep away from Middle East, the business of the Middle East. Once you're sucked into it, it's pretty uncertain. It's like, of course, there was an Orientalist discourse there as well, quicksand analogies like the backwardness and all that. I mean, that started to change, and I appreciate that this government's attitude towards Middle East changed and stopped seeing it from an Orientalist perspective, but that's my point. I think I'll pass the microphone to Bülent.
And if we look from the point of humanitarian situation, what needs to be done for those people who are under direct threat in northern Syria? Islamic State fighters are about to capture that town and maybe more soon after. As far as I can see, the military intervention, either by outside forces or by regional forces, including Turkey, will make the situation much worse. But so far, the last 20 years, there is no evidence to any positive military intervention in the region. So I am personally against any kind of military intervention whatsoever. What needs to be done is United Nations should immediately establish or try to establish a safe haven in northern Syria or between Syria and Turkey in that region, and for all those civilians who are escaping, running away from the danger zone. So if the military balance of power within Syria is on the side of the Islamic State, then there's nothing you can do. But you have to provide protection for the civilians. And I think all the efforts should concentrate on this rather than talking about who to give the guns and whether the guns should be given from the south, from the north. I think this is all these attempts concentrating on the giving guns to this group or that group makes things even worse and much more complicated and even morally much more difficult to justify. I think we have to concentrate on the civilian population and civilian casualties and try to provide some kind of a safety for the civilians. And I think UN can do this. And UN can convince Turkish government to allow a peace corridor in the north for the civilians to escape and to settle for the time being.
Thank you. Before I come to you, Mehmet, the ladies there, so ladies first, you know.
Yeah, I actually come from Lebanon, and obviously Lebanon now stabilize it. But why do you think the United States nations haven't stepped in yet? Because it's been going on for quite a few years.
I mean, yes, United Nations, when you say United Nations, there's Security Council, yes?
Yeah.
If when we look at the members of the Security Council, I don't know, I'm actually wondering as well. And that was the Turkish government's view yesterday in an interview that, Mevlüt Çavuşoğlu said that Turkey is not the UN. And it's true, Turkey actually, I don't know, 1.4 million refugees in Turkey. 1.6 is huge. Yes, 1.6, sorry. And but big figures, apart from exact numbers, huge. If you think like, compared with the number of refugees, European, there's a big fuss in this country. If 10,000, 5,000 people come here, it's a huge, huge thing. And also Turkish government, again, Mevlüt Çavuşoğlu yesterday spent 3.5-4 billion on refugees, and only aid they received from the external sources like 200 million or 400, it's very kind of small amount. And Lebanon, and of course there is also this talk at the moment, the Lebanization of Turkey in a way. And I heard this an extreme thing, the Lebanon is a good example. Sectarian politics and Kurds, Alawites, Sunnis, ISIS, are almost from an IR international relations perspective, almost Middle East is becoming kind of new medievalism. What do you do when you get rid of the nation states or the state? I'm not saying they were great, brilliant, dismantle them. You have to put something in their place. So what you have, you don't really have anybody to negotiate, to who's in charge, and these issues always are there, so I think they're going to continue to be there. So this is I think I'll pass the microphone to Gülen, maybe he can enlighten us more on the UN side of things.
I don't have a clear answer to your question, but this is what I want to say. I think, and I am surprised, and I listened to media quite a lot recently making this point, why everybody is focusing on a kind of military intervention. Even those writers who have historically been against military interventions, they keep talking about why is Turkey waiting? They did this big army, did this many times, why are they not intervening? And I kept criticizing this attitude. I mean, Turkey is providing some support for the refugees, and of course we have to provide this. I mean, some Turkish statesman is complaining about it, saying that no one is helping us. Well, it is easy to make claims that we are a great power now, and this is the consequence of being a big economic power. Turkey can easily afford to accommodate 10 times more people within Turkey in much more humane conditions.
Thanks. I think we're going to wrap up. Is there a burning question? One final one? I have to. Okay, I think it's okay. We can speak. So.
Well, really, I was going to say, do you think now this is going to be the beginning of Turkey actually giving up a section of land which has always been on the agenda with the Kurdish community? I can see somehow how politics is played in that region, and that one way or the other Turkey will be cornered into giving up part of that land and maybe calling it Kurdistan. Do you think that, maybe not in this week, next week or next year, but I think the steps are already in motion, and the more you look at the news and the more you see the maps, and the internet goes crazy with these maps already drawn out as to what's going to be where and who's going to have what. Do you agree with that? Do you think that will eventually happen in Turkey? Do you think Turkey will be pressurised into doing that?
Let me answer that question. I'm not sure whether it's bound to happen. Yes, there's early indicators. There are some early indicators. There's peace process. there is this absolute independence and an absolute subordination. There are other ways of arranging it, local democracy, federalism, and all that. But if it happens, it is not going to be a very peaceful thing. Okay? And the thinking in Turkey, the sovereignty, territorial integrity, whichever government is in power, or the state policy, I don't think any government can dare, So maybe because Turkish Kurds are offering democratic alternatives, even they themselves, the Kurdish Turks, do not talk about absolute autonomy or independence in a way, They're trying to find some solution to this local economy and all that stuff. I mean, this maybe we don't have much time, but when I was doing my military service, what this critical geopolitics this came from. Our commander, this was Republican Day, we had this big cake with the map of Turkey on it, and then I haven't had cake for a while. I was dying I was looking forward to eating it, and then someone gave him the knife. The cake is here. He just looked at the commander, looked at the cake, threw the knife away. I cannot divide my country, he said. I said, that's it, the cake has gone, So this I cannot divide my country rhetoric, actually that's anything comes up, so that's still there. Sorry, that's just, okay.
Well, when I was watching or following the Scottish referendum, I was exactly thinking the same thing. I hope there comes a time, hopefully soon, that in Turkey there will be a referendum for the Kurdish people to decide how to continue their life, whether within one single state or for independence or autonomy. So I think this must happen at some point. There is no other way. I mean, I understand what Tom said. Yes, there's a huge significant nationalistic element within Turkey. Even in the most liberal Turks, there is this nationalism you can see from time to time in certain discussions coming to the fore. Even among the majority of the Turkish left-wing people are nationalistic to some extent. But this has to happen. There is no other way. And when I was watching the events in Scotland, I was just watching with admiration. I mean, why not? What is wrong with that?
Sykes-Picot doesn't include misaki.
So, yeah, I mean, the distinction here, mine was what is the case empirically speaking, and of course, Bülent is much more normative. Yeah, I agree that there has to be some kind of autonomy, not maybe full independence, but what sort of autonomy? What about the other Kurds, Syrian Kurds, and then there's Kurdish regional government. So it's a highly, highly complicated thing, Yes, I agree with ideological reasons I agree with it, Scottish independence. But I find it also, in some ways, Scotland, and, if we pull out of the European Union, I'm now speaking like British citizen, and the UKIP comes to power, are we going to be Little Englanders? I'm a British citizen. Yes, we have to find some good solutions. Thank you. I think we have to end it here. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for a very stimulating session. Now, we're going to just change the program around a little, have a bit of time. So, the next session, Space and Place in the Turkish Metropolis, is actually to move to after lunch. We might have a little less time for lunch. And in the meantime, we're going to have a screening of a new work. Again, Kavshoglu, this is a work that's being featured at the 4th International Kanikali Biennale. I'm not sure if we're going back into contentious ground yet again, because this is structured upon the 1914-18 World War, which I think has lots of other areas for debate within it. I think I'll leave Ergin to talk about his own work. And,
I'll just wait.
I'll sit down and be quiet.
So from President
different conflicts to past conflicts.
Exactly.
Hello, I'm Erwin Joshua. I'm a professor of contemporary art here, and I'm also an artist working predominantly with film and video, which is what I'll be showing here. Now, I want to obviously align myself with Tunç's ideas on liminality, in-betweenness, and so on. So I'll kind of talk quite a bit about these ideas. And I would like to introduce this new project, which is a representation of very much of this broad engagement with ideas of in-betweenness and liminality that resonate throughout a range of my artworks. These concepts are central to my practice on a multitude of levels, and I have explored them in my works in diversity of media, including film, video, installation, and three-dimensional objects. The film I would like to show you is called Lundy, Louis, Barge, and Troy. This is a two-channel video installation that was commissioned and produced this year for the 4th International Chakra Biennial, which is entitled Only the Dead Have Seen the End of War, which comes from Plato. I would like to read a just very short excerpt from the introductory text of the biennial. The exhibition will be conceived in consideration of the 100th year of World War I and will focus on contemporary visual interpretation of this human tragedy and its political, economic, social and cultural consequences. This date is also indicating the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, which has radically changed the map of Europe and Asia and opened a new era which created a polarized world in the 20th century, which is pretty much what Tunç and Bruno talk about, this polarization in the region. Informed directly by this kind of historical consideration, the conceptual framework of Lundy, Louis, Barge and Troy is twofold. One screen presents the shipwrecks of the fleet of the Allies that was sunk in the approach to the Strait of the Dardanelles in Turkey during the Gallipoli campaign of World War I. The second video channel shows the bustle of contemporary vessels crisscrossing the blue waters above. I just want to mention that the work's title is composed of the names of the ships, and the edit of the footage implies that the battleships can perish along the same axis, one following the other. Basically, Lundy is I think it's HMS Lundy, Louis is definitely HMS Louis, and so on. Barge was, you will see, it doesn't have a name. I've been given some names about this particular shipwreck, but effectively it used to carry dead soldiers and wounded ones as well. So what you will see is that the camera tracks slowly over the length of the shipwrecks, thus revealing them from an unfamiliar bird's eye perspective. The decaying remnants are both hauntingly beautiful and menacing. We cannot escape thoughts about the circumstances of their ill fate. However, the work does not attempt to illustrate or narrate these uncontrollable conditions and acts of war. Instead, through a very particular filming technique of particularly scanning the seabed and the waters above, the work endeavors to signify the importance of the act of somber remembrance and reconciliation. This is a further kind of emphasized by the installation that presents the cinematic footage over two large, vertically positioned and set apart angled screens, thus acting like gates of heaven and hell, past and present. So what you're seeing here, this is the installation view from Çanakkale, but what I'll be showing you is basically an installation model, so you will get a better understanding of the work. It's fairly large. The screens are over 270 each. Lundy, Louis, Barge and Troy is very much about kind of shifting perspectives, whilst trying to consolidate the weight of the tragic historical events that occurred in and around the strait. Inherent in Çanakkale's geography, the symmetry of the surrounding landscapes, the seascapes, is the occurrence of constant shifts of perspectives in visual terms. Equally, due to this kind of strategic location, these major shifts have continuously taken place in the historical timeline, and there are plenty of remnants that are still inside. The sunken ships, on the other hand, are invisible to the general public, and they represent a kind of mental image and perspective. The work thus attempts to represent or to unconceal these ghostly ships, which could be analyzed on one side in relation to Heidegger's concept of aletheia, or unclosedness, or unconcealedness, or on the other hand, the disclosure and revelation of truth, or on the other hand, Walter Benjamin's ideas of the total image, or Denkbild, and the image desire with Begierung, which I've been kind of working with for over many years. Just to conclude, Lindy Louise Barch and Troy represents another installment of my work in the pursuit of themes of estrangement, seen earlier in works like Down Straits, I can show you still in a minute, and other works. The liminal zone of the strait, in Down Strait, that separates east from west. It's an interesting analogy with Erdogan's idea of building another strait parallel to the Bosphorus. But in this particular case, this idea of east and west is repositioned along the vertical axis, looking down and upwards, so as to imply a proactive space between existence and non-existence. This inversion of space acts simultaneously as point of reflection and spatial displacement. I'll just leave it here. I would like to show you maybe just a still from Down Strait to give an idea, because it relates to this work directly. Yes, this is Down Straits, which kind of forms a corridor, a viewing channel for the view to pass through, to experience the work. And I filmed the strait from both banks of the Bosphorus, kind of focusing on very particular buildings. Talking about the military, this is the military barracks on the Asian side. I have a Baroque mosque in Ortaköy, and then the Beşiktaş Stadium doing a game, which was a kind of a national pride as such. Anyway, I'll just gonna switch to the film and turn the lights off. Thank you. Because it's a kind of immersive installation, it's a spatial, you have to experience it in place, in physical location. But I'd hope to just give you an idea what the concept is and what the ingredients for the work. Yes, I mean there's so many anecdotes I can tell about the making of the work because it was very, very challenging. The ships are at different depths, some of them are 35 meters, some of them are at 28 meters on the water, and also that's reflected in the way they were filmed as well. Okay, I'm just going to probably leave it here unless you have some questions I can answer. Yes, that's it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed listening your new piece, I think it was very arresting. And I was wondering what sort of reaction response did you get when you showed it in the Biennale in Turkey?
Well, The reaction's been very, very positive. I mean, obviously, it's a very weighty subject to deal with, and this was directly responding to the theme, to the concept, to the locality, geography, history of the place. I mean, as I said, I was looking at it kind of introspectively, relating to my own practice in the past, as I mentioned, I was faced, but also I was thinking, how can I contribute? How can I add something, another layer of complexity, or how can I unconceal, as I mentioned, sort of these ideas of unconcealedness, unravel some of that history, but make it, visual and still something which is within the domain of art. And that's another subject, of course. But the reaction has been very, very positive. I think, as I said, the installation was produced very, very well in terms of the biennial context. So, yeah.
Very arresting piece.
Thank you. So I hope we can experience it one day in reality. Thank you.
Thank
you. Okay. Thank you.
Very much this morning, and I think there's some lunch in the back of the room, which you're all very welcome to join us for, and we'll start again in about 3/4 past time.
Today, Osman can say a little bit about herself. I guess, well, we're a bit of a double act, but I think we actually met pretty much 5 years ago in Istanbul. Osman travelled down the long schlep from Ankara, where she'd studied, undergrad and postgrad level, and I interviewed her for a PhD studentship in Istanbul. I was there for, I think, a conference. I can't even remember what the conference was about, probably cultural tourism. Culture and tourism was related. And here we are, 5 years later. This is Dr. Osman Benazor, so round of applause. Finished the PhD here. So a round of applause to me for still being here. We're still talking. We don't often present together, so that's a slightly personal, professional, and academic issue. Osman, of course, is Turkish, so she's a specialist. I'm neither of those. I have an interest in the urban cities. I used to run an urban research institute several years ago, so I'm interested in the urban, and therefore our focus is particularly on the metropolis, the city region, with a focus on Istanbul, but not uniquely. We might even touch on Izmir, a little bit on Ankara. So next slide. Really, we're just going to focus on a fairly general overview level on the theme of urban growth, which is inescapable if you're talking about the city region and Istanbul. in both historic and contemporary perspectives, and related to that, of course, the political, economic and symbolic spheres of urban space, and the two are inextricably tied up in the case of Turkey and Istanbul. So the three perspectives we're going to focus on a little bit more detail is the kind of land use, population growth and related urbanisation and sprawl. So I guess the spatial aspect that came up this morning is a particular focus. Focus on the cultural and creative industries as another kind of growth sector, and also as a representation of globalisation, as well as the kind of economic shift towards a kind of post-industrial economy. And finally, Oslo will focus on eventful cities, focusing on Istanbul's prospective attempts to win Summer Olympic Games through to its successful hosting of the European Capital of Culture in 2010. The last time I think I was in Istanbul was presenting at the forum that ran alongside the Capital of Culture. So those are the three themes. We could have chosen three others, but those are the ones that particularly interest us, and they obviously do connect in terms of this thematic issue of growth. So a little bit of history. This shows colour-coded the land use growth, if you like, the growth of Istanbul in both the European, Asian, Anatolian sides and the Byzantine era through the different Ottoman eras through to the early 20th century Turkish Republic. So we see quite rapid expansion and growth of the city in terms of its land coverage, and the population today, depending on where you draw the boundary and whether the count is up to date. It's never going to be up to date for any city. London's no exception to that. I mean, London misses probably several 100,000 people every time the census is done. So you round the figures up. 12 to 13 million, I guess we're talking about. I think the planners say the capacity of Istanbul is about 16 million. They think it will be full 16 million. Predictions are 20, 23 million. All those predictions in other mega cities, of course, are meaningless. The predictions are never accurate or timely in terms of when those figures are hit or not. And sometimes they go under significantly, sometimes they go over significantly. In terms of the types of land use, this starts to break down, if you like, the different land use areas, from the central business district, the industry zones, the large forest that those people that just go to Istanbul to the centre probably don't see unless they're flying over them, the historic core in the middle. Of course, the notable strand is that kind of yellow band of, pronounce it for me, Jikakondu, which I think maybe translates to built overnight. I mean, you might call it informal settlements or even squatter settlements. Not quite accurate. I mean, they can be buildings up to 2, 3, 4 stories, normally on historically on public land. But that, of course, is how accommodated the kind of rural urban migration into Istanbul, which of course defines very much that population growth and a lot of the urban infrastructure issues and challenges that the city faces. This is Osram's kind of long-term population projection. Of course, there was a blip after the new republic was established in the late 20s when Ankara was the new capital. So the population of Istanbul did in fact go down. So they obviously lost both economy and population. And other cities have gone through those for different political, social reasons. I think when the Quebecois sort of left Toronto, when Berlin used to be the capital of Germany and Bonn moved. So there's an interesting parallel of what happens in Brazil, when Brazil relocated its capital, Brasilia, built a whole city in a fairly inhospitable place, and the old colonial city of Rio. So it's an interesting historical comparatives in terms of what happens when capital and administrative cities are relocated for political reasons. But apart from that blip, I mean, there were, go into detail here, I mean, there were qualitative changes in terms of that population shift. Certainly the Greek community in Istanbul have been exempted from the Turkish-Greek transfer left. So in that respect, Istanbul probably became more homogeneous as a city than perhaps it was then. So that's also something to think about in terms of what that means today, whether that still holds today. This is a planners and geographers love to do this, compare the kind of city region to say they're pretty much the same, the land use cover. Then we can compare this as a metropolitan region in terms of its economic power and significance. And this is comparing Greater London and the South East with Greater Istanbul. Legal status, well, this is following up, I think, from the we're looking at the different kind of land use coverage. We're starting to see different statuses emerge in terms of settlement areas that are being changed, either being rehabilitated, knocked down, and new or formal housing developed, as well as the beginnings, if you like, of the decentralisation of developing housing in the kind of fringe areas, which is, and again, a pattern that other growing cities. If you look at the French banlieue, for instance, you have large housing estates in the fringe of the cities, and we're now living with the consequences of that kind of decentralisation. So how you actually hold together a city when it grows at that pace and that relatively unplanned, laissez-faire planning system. Istanbul did attempt, I think the French planner, Henri Prost, did a kind of master plan for Istanbul in the 30s that was predicated around a compact city, which is something you would never refer to in terms of Istanbul now. It didn't quite mean the compact city that we talk about in modern planning. Compact cities today are about mixed use, reliance on public transport, pedestrianisation, reducing the reliance on the motor car. For one thing, reduce pollution, reduce street crime and so on. His compact city was compactness, but it was also based around vehicular traffic, widening some of the roads, but also trying to keep an area working within, but relying on the motor car much more. Of course, that plan started to fall apart as the population growth and sprawl really took over. One particular phenomenon, I guess, if you're looking at global trends, the gated community is something we associate with North America. Now it's familiar in cities like London, Johannesburg, for similar and different reasons. And gatedness can, of course, be a sign of exclusiveness, and some of the early gated communities in Istanbul, probably just like in London, were waterfront, luxury apartments overlooking the Bosphorus and so on. And of course they started taking a different connotation. The trend was also about gatedness, separating from other communities and neighbours. I think the interesting thing is the gated developments have spread throughout the city, rather than just being concentrated in the centre, in some of those more luxury locations. I think finally the decentralisation, because in some senses Turkey is an industrial, agricultural, but also post-industrial country, so it's still got that mix. 38% of its manufacturing industrial production is textiles, but it's also moving towards some of the key post-industrial cultural and creative sectors that I'll move on to in a minute. I'll move on to in a second. Creative industries. This was a term that came out of the UK and Australia. In fact, there's dispute in terms of whether it started off in Australia or London, but pretty much at the same time, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and it was really a reflection, I suppose, that the old arts and cultural production sectors had started to be taken over by some of the new media and other wealth-creating sectors, which had also started to crowd out some of the old cultural sectors, and that happens in terms of where cultural production takes place, in terms of property, in terms of workspace, and in terms of where the investment is. It has a spatial dimension in terms of the kind of spaces that are needed to, in an old publishing house, it would be very labour intensive. We need quite large workspaces and printing presses and all that equipment, whereas the post kind of desktop publishing that started now into the digital economy needs far less physical space. So that's quite interesting, but what we start to see is that concentration that we always used to have when Alfred Marshall coined the term agglomeration theory in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that theory is based why do firms, entrepreneurs, cluster? Why do they locate in the same place when they're in direct competition with each other? And quite often when the cost of production, land, labour, may be more expensive there than going somewhere else. So it's a phenomenon which economists, geographers, planners, even cultural studies people, this comes very much from also Adorno and Horkheimer's notion of cultural production and kind of mass production. Cities are interested because they want to attract and keep those clusters, because that's where a lot of the new employment and innovation, the future is. Cultural actors are also interested in terms of what's the best place for us to be, an artist or a creator or a cultural worker. So there are both qualitative as well as quantitative as well as economic factors. But nobody really knows what the combination of factors are. I mean, what these board figures, and we're going to go through them, that compares, we've got Ankara here as well as Istanbul. The location quotient, we're not going to be, so an economist here will know that, but basically anything above 1 means there's a higher proportion of that activity in that city than the country as a whole. So that means that, for instance, 1.98, that Istanbul has a very high concentration of the publishing industry in Turkey. Yeah? Anything below 1 means they've got a lower proportion than the rest of the country. So I've just highlighted a few. We have a burgeoning film, movie, TV industry, which has been long established in one sense, and the film and TV and radio sector is an interesting one because we've had film and broadcasting corporations in most countries for quite some time, but it's gone through a renewal because of restructuring within the film and then the kind of digital video industries. And also the fact that Istanbul started to become a lower cost location for film production, taking business away from Hollywood, from London, because the labour costs are cheaper if you get that combination of skills, as well as good locations, as well as spaces. But that does mark up quite a high concentration of economic competitiveness, if you like, in the film industry, if you combine that with radio and TV. Interestingly, Ankara still maintains a huge dominance in terms of architecture and design. That would be partly because with the government there and other municipalities and agencies that cluster around, they are prime commissioners of architecture and design in terms of public investment in design, even though the investment may be in Istanbul. The commissions originate where the money is. It would be partly linked to clusters around higher education, METU, and architecture, one of the leading architecture and planning departments in Turkey. So these are quite interesting distinctions, which does signify that Ankara still is a cultural creative city in its own right, so it's not Istanbul and the rest. In terms of what's grown over this fairly short 2-3 year time period, we can see publishing, software, and radio and TV are the big growth sectors, but they're not necessarily the biggest employment sectors. The biggest one we can see there is commercial advertising in Istanbul, which again, itself is a signifier of a much more consumption, consumer-based economy, as well as serving a wider region, a region wider even than Turkey. So just a few figures there. This is kind of graphical illustration of some of these clusters. We selected 3, and this work came out of a joint study I worked on with Yildiz University and 2 other partner universities in Istanbul, which came out of the Istanbul Capital of Culture. They funded this first mapping study that had never been undertaken in Turkey. One reason is the data to do it didn't exist. It didn't exist in this country until about 20-25 years ago, so a lot of government and academic research effort has gone into trying to define what is the cultural and creative industries now, what do we include, what's creative and what's not. It's quite a big discussion there, as well as a technical discussion, quite a cultural discussion. What is cultural, what is creative, what do you include, what do you exclude. And that methodology was then transferred to this particular study. Then it was mapped geographically. A lot of it was built up bottom up rather than top down because of the lack of national kind of cultural economic data through professions, trade associations, knocking on doors, and just literally labour intensively walking around the streets to see where film production companies or fashion designers were based. So it's an incomplete, but actually that sense a more accurate picture. The first one is festivals, and they're quite interesting on festivals because, of course, they draw on a whole cultural production chain of venues, of performers, of artists themselves. Istanbul's grown hugely in terms of its from its fashion weeks to its art biennale, its design biennial, several music festivals, contemporary through to classical, jazz and so on. So it's put itself on the map in terms of a festival organising a place as well as a place to host festivals of different scales, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. This clustering, when I show the comparison here, it's not unique to Istanbul. This is Berlin, it's got a media and AV cluster. So this phenomenon of clustering spatially is something we see in other cities. So I guess what we've got is a very high concentration of different cultural productions which have an interrelationship. Film and fashion is always an interesting one because the film industry relies hugely on fashion in terms of its costumes, jewellery, a whole range of props and craft skills that go into that come from the fashion industry. So if you look at Hollywood, it's got the biggest fashion industry, jewellery industry next door to the Hollywood studios. Film is a particularly interesting cultural productions area because it needs those big spaces to do large-scale films, and they tend to be on the periphery because land and buildings are cheaper and they can't locate in the city. Other than that, there's a very close proximity between the fashion designers, the textile producers, because of the kind of flexible production that the industry now needs. It needs to be able to turn around new ideas very, very quickly. It needs that kind of high, not just speed of turnaround, but the skill, if you like, to turn ideas into reality. And Turkey, I guess, was a low-cost producer, massive textiles industry, took a lot of textile production from this country, and then what happened? Well, the Chinese took it from Turkey, so it's worked its way through. And Turkey, I guess, is going through a similar repositioning of its cultural profile as China is doing, moving away from its low-cost producer for other markets and for other design, where the design comes from outside, basically they're just producing for an external audience, is to actually creating its own brands. So we now see that Istanbul is a centre for fashion for Turkey, and you have Turkish fashion brands for the first time and known Turkish designers, whereas before, so they're just manufacturing low cost the outside world. And China, of course, is doing that, going from made in China to created in China, so subtle but important distinction. Okay, should we move on? Right, also I'm going to continue on the eventful cities, and I guess events or mega events, which is an area both of us do study, is a litmus test really of globalization. And I think I was thinking about this before, mega events like expos, Olympics, capitals of culture, are three prime examples. And I was thinking there's a powerful triangle. The IOC, who's the organisation that decides who gets the next mega event, the Summer or Winter Olympics, is based in Lausanne. The Universal Exposition Committee that says who's going to get the next expo, and these are massive competitions that cost bidders millions of pounds, and there's only one winner and several losers, is based in Paris. Brussels, of course, decides on the European Capital of Culture. And if we add a heritage designation into that, also based in Paris, the UNESCO's World Heritage Centre. So there's a little triangle between Lausanne, Paris, and Brussels that has quite a powerful influence, doesn't it, in terms of where these mega events, that cities and countries like Turkey and many, many others have invested a huge amount of effort, resources, and aspirations. Why they're doing that is something Osman is going to have to tell us.
So, as Graham mentioned, events and festivals has been one of the most significant policies that city governments has been adopting recently, especially since 1970s, to attract investment, tourism, qualified, skilled workers to the city, media attention, and so on. So it's fair to say Istanbul has been an eventful city all throughout the time. So some of the events that Istanbul hosted really significant in sports, design and culture. But Istanbul has been going through a significant challenge through the Olympics since 2000. And since then, Istanbul bid 5 times to host the Olympics. We see 4 logos there, because for 2012 Istanbul bid but couldn't even be a candidate city in that case. And since 2000 to 2020, Istanbul just missed one of the Olympic kind of bidding processes, which is the 2016. They didn't bid for it. But other than that, 5 times bidding for the Olympics. And obviously, this is a huge commitment, and that they are still, the government is still saying that they are going to keep bidding and get the event. So it hasn't been only bidding and advertising. So some investment has been done to be able to host the games. For the 2008 Olympic bidding process, to be able to host the 2008 games, they decided to build the stadium, the Olympic Stadium in Istanbul, which shows a commitment that we want it, and we already started establishing the infrastructure for it. But eventually, 2008 Olympic Games were hosted in Beijing, and the stadium isn't used much, and it's kind of converted at the moment. So some of the international football games are played, but since then it's been really derelict in a way, and no development around it really significantly changed. You can see it's kind of in a part of the city that squatter areas are still existing, and the urban development hasn't significantly changed in the area. So such an investment has been almost wasted, and it's not really used, which is not a promising message to IOC to show commitment and how we're going to make it afterwards, because one of the biggest challenges with the Olympics is what's going to happen to these venues after the games, and you need to show that you will be able to sustainably kind of use these venues, and already not hosting the games, and this venue is not used properly. So for the... Yes?
What did you take the pictures actually? Do you know the date?
Well, I'm not sure really. I'm taking it from an article.
It's not the same nowadays. They have changing the environment.
But I think it's with the perspective, the dimension you're taking from the picture would make a difference as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just next to the stadium, but I know that, I think if you remember, by the time, I think it was 2010, there was a U2 concert tour, and the Olympic Stadium hosted the tour. And you might see the news article papers saying that there was a power cut in the area during the concert, before the concert time, to hide the squatters around the stadium, so to show that, there's nothing else in the area. So I know that by 2010 it was still a problem, so it might change a bit now, but I guess it's still a challenge. So this is the plan Istanbul suggested for 2020, which is the recent bit. So they said they are going to focus on 4 zones around the city for the Olympics and kind of develop a ring road around it. And that will eventually kind of really feed back into the city and develop, kind of trigger the regeneration in the other parts of the city. So help to develop the infrastructure and kind of improve the structure in the city as well. So the idea was, I don't know if I'm doing something else. So the idea, the motto was using the whole city as a stage with the Olympics. And if you're familiar with the games, this plan might seem familiar to you. This is the Barcelona model, so-called Barcelona model. So that's what they achieved, and Barcelona model has been considered as one of the most successful urban regeneration through a mega event model. So Istanbul basically adopted a similar strategy and said we can reach success through this. But on the other hand, in the management side of it, Istanbul said we are going to adopt London 2012 delivery model to deliver this. So they said the main institution who is going to be responsible for the regeneration will be under TOKİ, which is a housing authority, the main housing authority in Turkey. So there will be a directorate under TOKİ, Olympic Directorate. But then there will be another structure kind of created only for the games, like the Olympic Delivery Authority in London, equivalent of it. And it will go to consortiums with other firms and subcontract them and kind of deliver the games, which was a kind of total confusion in terms of the structure, in terms of the model you bring, kind of really not feedbacking from the local dynamics and the structure, which is one of the problems, I think, that it hasn't been successful in the end. So Tokyo got the bit. But in terms of events, Istanbul has been successful in one of the major events, we must say. European Capital of Culture Istanbul was the first non-European Union city to host the European Capital of Culture in 2010. And one of the main things to emphasize, I think, in terms of their targets is obviously they're kind of telling about nurturing the culture and heritage, but as well as they are saying kind of really encouraging resident participation in decision making. So it's one of the targets in the list that they put beside culture and heritage. So I think this is a very important message, but the question is if it came to life. So the European Capital of Culture was really targeted towards urban renewal and change and kind of nurturing the heritage. These are just some of the projects that they've gone through. For example, the Hasan Pasha Gas House was an old industrial site which wasn't used at the time anymore. And the idea was kind of refurbish it and bring it into life again as a venue in a convention center. And there was some kind of heritage-related projects, for example, Küçükyalı Archaeological Park, which kind of really discovered while doing some works around the area, kind of infrastructural works, and they discovered there's an archaeological site there. And with the funding that comes through the European Capital of Culture, they really keep working in that area. Similarly, Yeni Kapı Transfer Point and Atatürk Cultural Center has been subject to some of the discussions around the time because there was a policy around demolishing it completely, but then the cultural and heritage value of it came into discussion again. And instead of demolishing, they went into refurbishing and kind of bring it into life again through the European Capital of Culture money. But I think the most significant of all of these projects, as Graham mentioned, Istanbul, with the funding that come through the Capital of Culture, Istanbul started the first cultural mapping project. So this was the idea was to kind of really make a big documentary of in the area in an online database. So the web page is still alive. So this is invanter.gov.tr, and basically it's an interactive map. So you click on the zone you want, and then it zooms further, and then eventually you find the building, the site that you want to get information about. And when you, for example, in this case, I just click, this is screenshots from the website, Büyüksaray, and then you get information about it. So this is really an important study in terms of really documenting what's in Istanbul in terms of culture and heritage. But the thing is, by the end of 2010, as the fundings kind of started disappearing, these studies most of them kind of stopped on the way, so couldn't finish or completed completely. For example, the plan of kind of translating the page into English hasn't been done yet, or kind of really populating it a bit more in terms of values and sites hasn't been done yet. So, and with some of the other projects as well, by the end of 2010, obviously not all the projects were finished, but as the money finished, some of the projects just left at this place that they were, and that was one of the big problems in terms of heritage side of it. And I think one of the criticisms towards European culture of capital was the kind of fragmented approach. I have done some interviews in 2010, towards the end of the year actually, with Korhan Gümüş is the executive committee member of European Capital of Culture. Sevinç Terzi was the urban regeneration director of the program. And they were acknowledging, although they really achieved some important things throughout the way, there were problems about the fragmented structure, and although they really wanted to start it as a bottom-up thing, kind of engaging with the public and everything, eventually turned out to be a more top-down approach, and with the funding and everything, kind of the decisions are taken as a top-down thing. And this was one of the main problems. And most of the events stayed as elitists, really concentrated in certain zones other than kind of really engaging the whole people in the area. And that takes us to another, not an event, but which has a kind of event-related and heritage-related dimension. Tunç already mentioned about the Occupy and Taksim Square as protests. But what started in May as a peaceful protest to about kind of demolishing of a park and the idea of turning it into a shopping mall turned into a bigger protest throughout the time. So basically the agenda was demolishing the Gezi Park, which is a small park in Taksim Square, and then in a bigger project under the transformation of Taksim Square, bringing the shopping mall back there. And I think what is kind of tricky about here when we talk about heritage and culture, the shopping mall, the design of shopping mall is mentioned as a building, an Ottoman building, the barracks that were there before the park. So basically what the government was suggesting, before the park there was this barracks here, so we are going to bring it back to life. So we are actually bringing the heritage back, which is kind of, you know, where we see the heritage, where we see the green space and the use of the space, and kind of really brings the question of whose city or whose right to claim the city. So it suddenly turned into a kind of, the protest turned into a situation that the kind of resistance of capitalism over kind of the individual's right to stay, to claim the city, so to reclaim the urban space. Which we see kind of the discussions, the right to the city by Lefebvre and Harvey's discussions about whose city, so the use of the city and how it's going to kind of, how it's engaged with people and how the government reflects on it, begs the question. I mean, do we have time for this? Shall I quickly go? Or we can cut here, it's up to you.
No, keep going. Just
Yes,
a few more
just
slides.
it's just, so another example is, since we are talking about bidding for big mega events, is Izmir around the same times actually bid for Expo in 2015 and 2020, and they were both unsuccessful. And with the kind of history of Izmir, with hosting the Izmir International Fair for 80 years, they were quite confident that they could get this. And their team was kind of New Roots to a Better World and Health for All, with the thinking about all the resources in Turkey, the hot water, and being a health capital beforehand, really. So bringing that into life and kind of reflecting in Expo seemed to be a clever idea. But the site chosen was not really created lots of conflicts again. So it was the site was in Ciraltı, which was in the southwest of Izmir, which was denoted as an agricultural site in 2005 by the Department of Agriculture. But then suddenly all the plans changed and it turned into the expo site. And then obviously lots of conflicts came around it. And it's kind of the really bringing the investment in, the idea of bringing the investment in, but not kind of protecting the site, kind of demolishing an agricultural site created the conflict, and it went to court between Chamber of City Planners and the government, and this went on and on. So I believe one of the kind of reasons that affected the success of ExpoBit was kind of the conflicts around the site choice and how to kind of approach the conflicts between stakeholders. It wasn't really a problem-solving approach. It was more like, we want this site and it's going to be here. So no negotiation, no openness to negotiation was one of the problems that came with it. And eventually in 2020, Expo 2020 has been awarded to Dubai, which is going to be the first non-European city to host Expo. And Izmir was going with a similar motto, we're going to be the first one. But with a really significant difference between the candidates, they will be hosting the next Expo. So I guess that's, yeah. If you want to add anything on that.
No, that's fine.
That's all we're going to say. So if you have any questions, any comments, any contributions to this, we're happy to go through. Yes?
Do you think the local government, the local councils, especially like Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, do you think they have in place proper questionnaires for the public? I mean, it came up earlier that the government are or want to ask the public's view on schemes and urban designs and planning applications. I mean, in England you go to the planning department and the local government decides if it's too big, then central government kind of plugs its nose in. But in Turkey, is there even a small, even a fraction of that procedure in place?
I mean, in terms of public consultation?
Do the public really have a say in what
I
happens
think
in their area?
in terms of mega events, like this big scale events, it's hard to, it's public consultation, it has always been a problem, even in London, you know, they always come up as a top-down approach and kind of engaging public and getting their views. It's always kind of, they do sessions and kind of consultations, but most of the people will say it's just to tick the boxes. They come to us. So our ideas didn't change anything, they would say. I think during the bidding process, none of the public has been kind of consulted. So I should stop. It's a sign.
It's thunder outside.
Static it's all good, it's great. Hands are the best. That seems working, yeah.
No, I was just going to remind that we have the right of and chance of choosing the color, the type, the design of the buses and ferry boats, lots of different transports, public transports at least, and the color of them, lots of things. There was lots of biddings, and then we had, as a public in Istanbul, in Ankara, in Izmir, I know, even in Hatay, we have had the right and the chance to choose it. So,
but in terms of really big decisions, that's gonna change your life and impact your life.
That's
it's the color of the bus isn't enough to. for the, so it's just saying that we give you the, you know, you said something and we did it, so just shut up now, kind of approach. I don't know if you find it genuine.
It is obviously genuine. I mean, as you mentioned, you don't have any right, and what is the word? I don't know. You don't get to choose whatever you want to say, what you want to do in every aspect of in your public life. But this is good. It's better than nothing. In London, do I get any choice to ask anything about what I would like to have any color on the buses? I hate black buses. That makes me depressive. You know, I'd like to kill somebody when I see any red bus. That makes me depressive as well. So it's down to the personal understanding.
But on huge schemes that affect the area that people live in, with the schools and for transportation and the other. Some of these schemes are huge and they take away the livelihood of businesses that people depend on to survive. So that is really more, I'm not really interested in what the surroundings are, but the day-to-day living and the economy and how it affects people that have lived in certain areas for centuries as families, because most Turkish families do tend to live close to each other. Our culture seems to be, I don't know if it's changed, but it's still the same in mine. We all like to live close together. But that's what I was, because some of these schemes, not only the very big ones, there's lots of schemes that you hear about on television, and they are all changing so drastically and fast, and new roads, and it does seem to change people's lives. And I wondered how much input really people have to that. Not much, I shouldn't think. No.
Thank you very much, Graham and Austin. I must confess, I keep getting letters asking what I think about the new runway terminal at Heathrow. Whatever. Or paint it yellow. It'll make me smile. Right, well, thank you both very much. I found that extremely interesting, having done quite a bit of work in Ankara myself. So I think at this point I'll hand over to Maggie Butt, who I think is going to share the next session, talking about other dialogues between Middlesex University and Turkey. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask, is Peter here now?
Yes.
Oh, lovely. Can I ask Peter and Nina to come up as well? Thank you.
Do you want this?
I don't know, can you hear me without that?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I'll turn it off. It's there and listening.
All right, lovely. Thank you very much.
Maggie's right. I'll stay left.
Okay. Okay. Somebody's mobile phone is here.
I'm recording. My recorder is finished.
Okay. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be the last session of the day, and we're going to endeavour to shorten it a little so that we will still finish on time. There are, as they say, a few changes to the published programme. The first of those is that you will see in the notes that this session was to have been chaired by my colleague Fiona Dalton. Unfortunately, she is unwell and has had to leave. And also you can see that there are 3 of us, not 5 of us. And that is because the...
Can I decide?
Thank you. Has had to leave also for family reasons. So my plan is to read to you the notes that Fiona would have delivered beautifully, and I have to ask you to forgive me for reading those notes. I will then tell you a little bit about my job, what I do, and then I'm afraid I also have to leave because I have a train to catch. But I will hand over then to Peter and to Nanette, who will finish this session. So I hope everybody understands what's going to happen now, who we are. I'm going to test you on it. So let me begin, if I can, by saying a little bit about the things that Fiona Belton would have said. We are members of Middlesex University. We have different roles here, and we're going to tell you a little bit about that and how we would like to, how we're already working with Turkey and how we would like to be working more with Turkey. Fiona was intending to start by giving us a bit of context about higher education in the UK and Turkey, and about the fantastic opportunities that there are for both parties. So, for example, in Turkey, the number of universities has doubled over the last 10 years and now numbers 170. However, there is still unmet demand for higher education in a country with a dynamic economy and a population in which 43% are aged 24 and under. So a lot of young people wanting educational places. Is there a slightly peculiar... Just see the microphones. Yes. Okay, well we'll live with it. Live with the sound. The President of the Council of Higher Education predicts that a further 100 Turkish higher education institutions will be accredited in the next decade. Well, we at Middlesex University see this as a fantastic opportunity, both for our students to travel, to share in the education that's being offered in Turkey, and for Turkish students to travel here to us. You may well know, and I apologise if I'm telling you things that you already know, that Turkey and the UK already have a very strong relationship with a knowledge partnership having been created a few years ago between the two countries to increase investment and trade through collaborations in higher education, science, innovation and industry. And this opens the door to more research partnerships, student and academic exchanges, joint degree programs and policy decisions. This is important given that a British Council survey last year found that 95% of students surveyed by the European Intelligence Research Service wanted to study overseas. This is Turkish students, 95% wanted to study overseas. Most citing the UK and the US as their most popular choices because they were because they wanted to improve their English language skills. But actually, there are very small numbers travelling to the UK or the US, with the largest numbers travelling to Germany. So again, opportunity for us. There is also a lot of fantastic new opportunity through the Erasmus Plus scheme, and I'm now the institutional coordinator for our university for Erasmus and international exchange, so I will say just a little more about that in a moment. Middlesex, though, is developing a lot of expertise in Erasmus bids, strategic partnership bids. We had a Jean Monnet Chair granted to us this year, and also we had 3 successful Erasmus bids. So we're hoping to partner with other places and have more of those. We have, as you may have noticed, if you've managed to escape from this room for 5 minutes, a very diverse student body, as well as a lot of diversity with our staff group here. And Turkey is a country which has specific interest for us, both in terms of academics, working with academics in Turkey, but also the possibilities for student incoming and outgoing travel. Fiona, had she been here, would have been able to talk to you about our summer school programme. And we are very interested in welcoming students here during the summer when our facilities are a little less full than they are in term time. And we offer tailor-made programmes for groups of students coming here in the summer. We also have pre-sessional courses for English language tuition, which a lot of students from overseas are happy to take up and find prepares them very well for degree study here. Peter Ryan is going to be talking to you in a few minutes about his own particular project, and then Mehmet is going to be talking to you about work-based learning. So these are two different areas that we're keen to establish and go further. And in the spirit of the exchange of ideas and the whole ethos of today, we would really welcome any discussions and suggestions that you have about different ways in which we could work together. But one of the things that we try to pride ourselves on is our flexibility and our openness to new ideas and new suggestions, and we certainly don't think that we have a monopoly on that. We know that other people have great ideas that we hope you will bring to us. So perhaps I could just say a little about myself and my role within the university. As I say, I have to leave, I'm sorry, after this session, but I have left some of my cards there. So if I say anything that you would like to have a further conversation with me about, then please do pick one up and get in touch. As I say, my name is Nigel Bart, and I am Associate Director of our Centre for Academic Partnerships. Middlesex University is very interesting, was really ahead of the game in becoming an international university. We currently have more than 40,000 students studying for Middlesex University undergraduate degrees, but less than half of them are here on our London campus. More than half of them are spread throughout the world, and some of them are on our own campuses, and we have our own campuses in Dubai, Mauritius and Malta, running Middlesex University programmes, not exactly as they're taught here, with localisation to make them appropriate for the area, but quality assured in the same way as our programmes here. And we also have a great many partner universities across the world running one of two models, either franchised programmes, so the programmes that we have here, a bit like a McDonald's franchise, you get the same thing. We would hope your burger would taste the same wherever in the world you had it. And the programmes that we franchise out are quality assured and assessed back here in London. And there are some parts of the world, like Hong Kong, for example, where they're only allowed to run foreign universities franchised courses. But we also try to invent new models where new models are needed. And we have a great many partners across the world running validated courses. And that means they have designed and written the course themselves, and we go through quite a complex procedure to quality assure that in terms of our UK Quality Assurance Agency, and to give it the stamp of quality of British higher education and also a Middlesex University degree. So, for example, we have a very big art and design college in Athens and Thessaloniki, running Middlesex University degrees taught partly in English and partly in Greek. And we have a large number of students on that, and students on all sorts of other courses around the world. However, to our great chagrin, we have none in Turkey as yet. So this is opportunity for us, and it's not for want of trying. Our staff have been going to Turkey for many years, having conversations, everybody gets terribly excited. Then I'm afraid we sometimes come up against the difficulties which puts it in our way. I hope I have pronounced that correctly. However, it seems to me there are possibilities, things that we perhaps haven't explored. The possibility of joint master's programmes, for example, which oh, that's gone the way of all flesh. Okay. Still, I'm enthusiastic and hopeful, and I think perhaps I will take advice from Millet, but perhaps that's something that we can do. I've also worked for quite a long while in our art and design department, our art and design school, and explored the possibility of running an art and design foundation course with a partner in Turkey to enable students to be able to come into our art and design programs here without having to pay for an art and design foundation course there. So, you know, lots of ideas, and I'm open to lots more ideas. We have lots of different models of things that we could do, articulation agreements by which students on courses in Turkey could come into one of our existing courses. And last time I was in Istanbul, I was talking to centres which run EdExcel HND programmes and talking to them about the possibility of their students transferring here to take the last year of a degree programme. So there's lots of models and lots of possibilities, and as I say, I would welcome any further suggestions that people have. One of the other things that I seem to have in my portfolio is that I'm in charge of study abroad, and that means students coming in particularly to study here for a year on our courses, which obviously gives them a fantastic edge on their CV. So I'm interested in talking to people about boosting that. I've already mentioned that that I'm institutional coordinator for Erasmus, and we are going to have a big push later in the year, or perhaps in the beginning of next year, to try to encourage more of our own students to go out on Erasmus exchanges. And I'm particularly interested in the new possibilities that have come through Erasmus Plus for students, doctoral students, PhD students going on funded placements. I think that's really exciting. And it may well be that our colleagues who've got research connections with universities in Turkey can be talking to those universities about the possibility of PhD students getting that experience. I'm also interested, and I don't know whether any of our colleagues who are not part of the university might have some ideas about this. There is also money for UK students to travel, internships, work placements. Now, many of our students are reluctant to travel because they have jobs and they don't want to give up their jobs. But the new Erasmus Plus rules allow them to go for just 2 months and get funding. So this is something we want to explore. If we were able to find placements for students for 2 months in the summer when they're not at university, would they be willing to take up that opportunity? We have a great many Turkish-speaking students, so this is something that I would like to explore further in the near future. We have 5 existing Erasmus exchange partner universities in Turkey. Those are Istanbul University, Istanbul Technical University, Istanbul Bilgi University, Yeditepe, and the Middle East Technical University, which I know Dana has very strong connections with. So those are perhaps the place that we want to begin this possibility of growing doctoral exchanges, or perhaps internships. Perhaps our students could go and actually work at those universities for a couple of months in the summer. So lots and lots of different possibilities. But in particular, what we want to do is join things up a bit more than they have been so far. So we have all these fantastic research projects that are happening. All of the people who've spoken today, who've got projects happening in Turkey, how can we join that up with some of the other things that we want to do, with summer schools, with internships, with research exchanges, with study abroad? How can we start to speak the same language and pull those together each to enhance the other? So that's me, that's my ambition, and I look forward to hearing from any of you. As I say, I've left some of my cards on the table over there, and if you would like to contact me to make any suggestions about any of those things, I would be extremely glad to hear from you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bennett.
You want me to introduce my dear friend, Professor Peter Wright?
Very glad.
Yes, I'm introducing my dear friend Peter Wright. We spent some wonderful time in Ankara together. He kindly, I'm trying to find the right word, he asked me to be his Sherpa for the summit. And we went to Ankara for some very delicate tripartite negotiations between Middlesex, that was the easy part, World Health Organization, relatively easy, and of course the Turkish National Ministry of Health, which wasn't all easy. So the triangulation was quite complicated, and it was delightful working with Peter. It was wonderful to see him in action. It's very beneath that quiet and vital exterior there lies a real operator. And seriously, the levels of sensitivity, the levels of Middlesex teamwork, and the kind of leadership, in the good sense of the word, leadership, which Peter provided, for example, I shouldn't do that. So I'm so glad that he's going to now talk about some of our experiences and other things, and things happening in the future.
Mehmet, that's a wonderful introduction, and thank you very much. And I think you're a sort of inspiring kind of orchestrator of all these chemical interactions that were happening to make this project possible. I wanted to give a thanks to Dana, actually, and the Institute of Ideas, who, with typical energy, put together this symposium today on Turkey, and has made it such a exhilarating event. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of it. I suppose what I'm going to be talking about is an example, almost a case study of a piece of social policy initiative within the Turkish context and within the WHO context. And just to prefigure it briefly, I was very interested by Tug's presentation this morning, and I think in terms of classically, historically, how Turkey has positioned itself, it's a question of seeing how the various kind of stances and positioning have worked themselves out. I think in social policy terms, we can see it in terms of our particular piece of work. Westernising on the one hand, Islamicizing on the other, working with particular influence groups and political structures, etc., and so on. And within this particular piece of work, I think we can see how that kind of played itself out. Can we go on to the... If I gently raise a glass, I'm not drinking at least, time for another slide. Okay. I'll be hopefully about quarter of an hour maximum, actually, because it is going towards the end of the day. Within mental health, I'm Professor of Mental Health at Middlesex, the overall context as you all probably will know anyway, is a huge worldwide transition from warehoused, hospital-based care that typified the 40s, the 50s, and the early 60s, where nobody really was in the community, and where patients were looked for without much contact with the families, maybe for decades. So it was very much an institutionalized sort of framework in which once in a hospital you didn't really very easily get out, or if you did, you came back pretty quickly because there were no psychoactive drugs to help your symptom patterns. So I think, very briefly, many societies up and down the world, in terms of the UK, we started this in the 60s, have been engaging in this process of deinstitutionalization. Turkey, fair to say, has come pretty late to that process. Interesting to speculate why. So until certainly 5 years ago, there was very little in terms of non-institutional structures in the whole mental health or learning difficulty field. So you had in Turkey these huge institutions, 2,000 to 3,000 patients, mixed learning difficulty and mental health, with all the mental health workforce of psychiatrists and social workers, psychologists, nurses, tied up within that framework. And that was the kind of sticking point. Now, what I think we can we, oh, I've got to use my cue. Okay, so basically, I think about fairly recently, 5 years ago, that there began to be signs of change within the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Social Care in Turkey. What they were beginning to identify is what's been identified everywhere else, which is that there are huge problems about the locus of power and influence, which is the mental hospital, and in many societies until recently, fairly sparse community alternatives to them. Typically, what societies do is to massively underestimate what's required to change that around. For example, in the UK, we did very little at all in terms of planning ahead of time community alternatives. We closed the hospitals. Halfway through, we thought, oh dear, we better do something about this. And so we began to develop community and health centres and teams, but really not in any kind of coherent way tied up with closures. Because all the traditional psychiatric and mental health training has been based traditionally, and this was certainly the case in Turkey, on preparing people to work in huge asylums and institutions, there was very little knowledge about how do you do things differently once you get outside in the wider community. Nobody really knew. And linked with that, workforce shortages. No workforce planning capabilities to think through, well, how many, if we do expand into the community and keep our hospital services, how many psychiatrists, social workers, nurses are we going to need? How do you restructure the training program, etc., and so on? By natural ways, one pass. Could you repeat it? Okay. I think some of my slides didn't. Could you go back to the previous one? Now, what I put on there hasn't actually got saved, so I should extemporize. I think what Middlesex did was to come in at WHO's invitation, very much with a view to help with this process. What we did was to actually help WHO to ensure that the community support systems necessary were going to be in place. So I had an early role in terms of orchestrating quite complex change management processes which were needed to bring together hospital systems, community systems, psychiatrists, social workers, etc. and so on. Fairly late in the day, what happened was that WHO asked us to develop an educational program to support those processes. What that process was something in the order of a blended learning program, which began to be a requirement that began to percolate from their interest and consultation with the field about 14 months ago, so fairly recently. Blended learning can be completely online, or it can be mainly face-to-face. If you can move on. What we were able to achieve, I think, in a pretty short period of time, we started this operation, in fact, theoretically last summer, but because of the complex process of negotiation and the difficulties in ensuring that funding was in place, etc. and so on, a program that was going to initiate last September, in fact started in January. And because WHO itself was going to finish its contract in April 2014 this year, we actually had to do everything in 3 months. So it was a very, very short order process. What we wanted to do was to develop a system of care that for the new workforce that was taken out from physical hospitals, from mental hospitals, psychiatrists, teachers, beg your pardon, social workers, nurses, etc. What we wanted to do was to reframe their skills and to reframe their knowledge into new outputs and new expertise sets. So we were really working with the new projected community mental health centres. There was about 363 that were planned to be opened in 2.5 years. So one of the other characteristics that is formidably impressive about Turkey, once a course of action is decided, it gets rolled out with a fierce intensity almost. So we were having to provide training for around 350 community mental health centres right across the country. As to why that's necessary, I think the idea of blended learning was an idea that was born out of knowledge of the new technologies that were emerging elsewhere, and that they turned, this is where the westernising influence comes in, I think, to a culture such as in the UK, where over the last 30 to 40 years, we've done perhaps more work than most places elsewhere in restructuring our training, refocusing it, repointing it in terms of appropriate delivery systems and content for the new workforce that was working not so much now in hospitals but in the community. And so they looked to Middlesex to be the consultant expert to bring that around. So the overall focus was to enhance decision making of the teams and to enhance their overall levels of skills. What we did was to build our expertise very much around the clinical guidelines which the Ministry of Health had itself developed in the previous year, again a very recent initiative. And so what we did was to weave education, knowledge, skills within their operational guidelines as to what the core role should be of nurses, social workers, psychiatrists, and so on. In about 10 modules, which you see there. So I won't go through them in detail here, because unless you're a mental health kind of nut, as I am, of course, they won't necessarily mean that much to you. Basically, our task as of January this year, finishing in April this year, were to do two things. Firstly, to design talk material, 2 days talk material in each of those areas, and to add up to that about 10 hours worth per module or unit of online sort of instruction. So what we did in about 6 weeks. It was really a very intensive process, I can tell you, sleepless nights, was to set up talk material in these areas and combine with that online material to do that. In order to do that, we had to work very collaboratively across the university, as Mehmet said, not least with Mehmet himself, but also with CAPE, unit for educational transfer and so on, Alex Chapman, Sheila Cousins, Kirsty McDonald, and also about 7 or 8 people within the mental health department here at Hendon. So it's a team at one stage of about 15, 16 people weaving away in different ways to produce all this material in next to no time. You know, it was very high profile work. Why the hurry? Firstly, as I've said, WHO itself was completed in April, and then the idea was not for us to develop the material or to develop it and not to produce it, but to train Turkish trainers. So in the month of March, we went out, or we all went out there and trained Turkish trainers who were a combination of academics in a number of universities, but also frontline staff, psychiatrists, nurses, social workers, psychologists, to train in this rather new way. I think it's true to say that the pedagogic traditions in many places in Turkey tended towards being somewhat traditional, so chalk and talk, PowerPoint, as I indeed am doing now, that kind of process. And the work we had developed in the UK was very much group-orientated, small task, group feedback, role-play, simulation, that kind of stuff. So a very different modality of education, really. So that was one of the things we were trying to orientate and to restructure. And what I think we were able to do was to really think through how best to do that and how best to get that organised. And finally, in April, we actually were able to, or we weren't able to, we mentored, supported, advised and supported about 20 Turkish trainers who taught about 200 Turkish community mental health staff throughout the month of April. So a very intensive process. In terms of reflections about it, I suppose what I would say is firstly that there are issues of sustainability. Very quick process. WHO now left Turkey. They have 10 modules with 100 hours of online materials. We know that they did a really good job with respect to 3 of those, which is what we chose to do in the time available. What we don't know is how that perpetuated or how that's working now. We hear informally we may be invited back to continue the good work, and I hope we are, but they call you, you don't call them, you know, so I have no idea whether that's going to happen, if so, when. But there have been some further very interesting developments. Firstly, a university that Mehmet knows very well, Koç University in Istanbul. They came over in August, and we have already, with them, submitted €1 million responsible research. $1 million, $1.2 million.
Why get the introduction?
Of course you can. So you have your consultation fee.
Sorry, no comment. 10 to 4 on a Friday afternoon.
And we did that in 3 weeks in September. And we were very tired, I tell you. But they were wonderful to work with. Some of the most focused and professional and exciting and creative staff I've ever come across, with their Romanian partner and Italian partner who we introduced to them. So that's really happened. Also what's already happened is that we are part of a Horizon 2020 bid with Turkey and with 8 other European countries, including Germany, but in particular Serbia, Lithuania, Hungary, and we'll be rolling out this blended learning approach, if we get funded, across those other countries as well as more work in Turkey. So I think it's been a very intense, exciting piece of work, very exhausting, but I think very productive. So that's it really, and over to Mehmet for your peroration.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. It combined something very interesting. One, I'm very impressed with the Middlesex team, which was very, very sensitive to the cultural differences and respectful. And it wasn't this, they land and teach Turkish people what to do, etc. It was genuinely interactive. So that's something which I really appreciate about that. And the other thing was the technology transfer, developing new types of communicating knowledge. And the blended learning system is relatively new in Turkey, and people took to it very, very enthusiastically. And I could gauge the responses in the rooms as you were holding forth. So that was very, very impressive. As we say in Turkish, I'm glad that I had a pinch of salt in the broth. Again, aware at 10 to 4 on a Friday afternoon. There are certain things which I want to say, I want to get off my chest. But I'm also aware that Orhan is here, so and Tunç is here. And it may, I mean, it would be good if we can line up ourselves here like a bunch of coconuts. So I think you should join us. People stay there.
I don't know what you want me to do.
Just stay here, because I'm wrapping it up. I'm doing a wrap.
I told you much was back.
Why are you going?
Because my colleagues are coming here.
Just come join.
Yes, join, but I don't know.
Sort of security in numbers, as they say. Right, so this should take about 15 minutes, but I'm a bit long-winded. It takes me 1,500 words to clear my throat, so just forgive me for that. This is kind of a quick little thing here. It says, very dikerdem, keep on going, past and present. What the hell does it mean? It means this. The French utopian socialist, Charles Fourier, had a dream. And to establish this dream, his dream was to get lots of money from lots of rich patrons, and then take his followers from this kind of messy place called France, and take them to North America, where they would settle and create the ideal community. So he spent most of his week sending begging letters to people, right? Will you give me some money? So like, and once a week you'd go to a certain cafe, expecting that some benefactor would turn up and give him this tremendous amount of money, this lump sum. So he'd take his followers to North America. Of course, it never happened. So this kind of, I'm giving you this parable because it kind of does in a way reflect my relations. And I've been in this institution for 30 years. That's quite a long time. For the past 25 years, 17 years with you, 20 years with you, we've been doing lots of Turkish things. So we're not kind of Johnny-come-latelys into the thing that, you know, we have been, historically, a Turkey and Turk-friendly university, right? And I'll just very briefly explain what I mean by that. But of course, during this 25 years, a hell of a lot has happened in the higher education, British higher education sector. From Tony Blair declaring when he came in that every 16 to 30-year-old, 50% of 16 to 30-year-olds should be at university, from the widening participation agenda of the 1990s, we sort of come back with a vengeance to the kind of 1950s notions of elite universities focusing on research, publish or perish, and so on. There's going to be a gladiatorial fight. We were mentioning 176 universities in Turkey. There are 143 universities in this country, with something like 27 in London. I'm exaggerating. So it's London's, after Boston, is one of the anyway. So there's been kind of shifts in the parameters as well. So, I mean, one thing about Middlesex is that, I mean, there are, although today I could see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 colleagues, we are 20 plus colleagues. And we do have something called Turkish-Speaking Staff Association of Middlesex University, TUSTAMO. But I mean, it's there on paper. So I mean, every so often, I've got 26. But it is true that this is the number of Turkish staff is the largest in British universities. So that's one of the things. We also have before we all kind of came to Hendon, sunny Hendon, we used to have campuses at Enfield, Tottenham, which were at the heart of Turkish-speaking communities. So we were cheek by jowl with the Turkish communities. So our hinterland, our sort of catchment area involved a lot of Turkish-speaking people. And that's where you come in, and you do a lot of work at the time, reaching out to the communities. Kids coming in like busloads to seeing for the first time the guys from Turkish schools, Saturday schools. And that's where we miss Kenani as well. Kenani was a leader in arguing that all these kids who were sent to special education, special needs class and things like that, if you taught them maths and science in their own language, in Turkish or Kurdish or whatever, then suddenly their achievement would sort of rise. So there was that element. So there was a lot of people spending a lot of energy trying to help the second generation Turkish-speaking kids. Why? Because, unfortunately, sadly, still now, our Turkish-speaking minorities in Britain are lowest achievers in educational terms, slightly up in now certain places. I think some North London boroughs, but in Hackney, Enfield, etc., rock bottom. Unfortunately, a position we share with the Somalis, and the Bangladeshis, Islingtons, etc. So, I mean, we've sort of had all this experience. Also, during these kind of years of widening participation, we did a lot of teacher training. A lot of people were trained by Middlesex University, so we do have a brand recognition. And also during these years, with the good offices of Leslie Marks, a lot of Turkish people came from Turkey itself to study at Middlesex. And part of our distinguished alumni are Falis, right, the governors. We had cohorts of kaymakams coming over, who have sort of risen in the state hierarchy. We've had the General Secretary of the Prime Minister's office. And
by the way, the governor in charge of the culture in the Capital of Europe project did an MA degree in international relations here. I mean,
and we had a member of parliament, female of parliament, yes.
Özlem Birtanoğlu. And then Prime Minister's office, Kalem Müdürü, how do you translate that?
Yeah, well, that's so. I mean, and then we sort of held seminars in Turkey. So looking at SOAS, LSE, and other rivals. I mean, they had the franchise. They had the franchise on Turkish studies. So we thought, well, why don't we get the franchise on Turks in Britain and Turks in Europe? Again, that's kind of the thing. And ever since then, a bit like Charles Fourier, and I had this dream, and this dream was based on Brixton Social and Cultural Archives. Why don't you start a social and cultural archives of Turkish settlements in Britain, to start an oral history project, artifacts, and various things, and trace the kind of, it was like, it's been almost like in slow motion, and witness the emergence of the community. And I was telling our distinguished secretary from the Turkish embassy, in 1965, when I first came here, by the way, the entire population in this country, Britain, of people born outside Britain and from parents born outside Britain, that population was 450,000 when I first came to this country. Now, sort of figures are being bandied around that there are up to 300,000 Turkish people alone living in this country. So that's how things have moved over the past 50 years. We could tell in the mid-60s, the number of Turks living in London, the embassy signature book. You know exactly who was there, their names, addresses, and things like that. Of course, the community has changed, and the social and economic composition of the community has changed. My idea was to bring this together to form some kind of a resource, a university-based resource, which could be accessed by communities and used. I tried it, I wasn't successful, but I'm pleased to say that with the good offices of Professor Ibrahim Sirkeci of Regent's Park, Regent's College, we are now engaged in launching something which is going to lead to a sort of like the Brixton Black Cultural Social Park, something similar to that. So that's something which has come out of this period. I think a turning point was a conference which Tunç attended and spoke at, and which, of course, the primary speaker, the guest speaker, Astoris, was the late member of Iran. This was the Writing Turkey conference organized by Gerald
who also wrote the biography of the president.
Gerald has currently written Abdullah Gül's biography. Unfortunately, he's disappeared from the Turkish scene. But anyway, Gerald spent a brief time at Middlesex. But the conference, Writing Turkey, the book, it was published by the then Middlesex University Press. And it's a very valuable book, and it's quite rare. And out of that book emerged the Anglo-Turkish Education Fund, the monies which we collected for that conference, and was turned into the Anglo-Turkish Education Fund to fund, initially, teachers to be educated at Middlesex University, and then go into the communities and, as role models, as kind of people who speak the language and know the culture, ensure some kind of education achievement in the community. And that ATEF, the Anglo-Turkish Education Fund, still exists, and I think we will use our last tranche apparently this November. We then had the bright idea that if we can do this with teachers, why don't we go and collect money from businessmen, fund a scholarship for business studies, collect money from Turkish-speaking lawyers. There's a Turkish Lawyers Association here, Turkish Bankers Association. Get it from different professions and found scholarships for deserving Turkish kids. And of course, what happened was that university fees started going up, and also so we could not afford sort of big sums. And another thing which happened at the same time was that a lot of the religious groups, the Jamaats, moved in to our space, and they're doing much better than we're doing, and they provide schools. Apparently, one of the biggest ones, which is called Mount Faber, is the famous Hendon Police College, and it's turned it into a boarding school for kids coming from all over Europe and things like that. So this was, if you want, during the widening participation period. I was making sort of noises while my colleague Maggie Butt was talking, because we really had some strange, although we're sort of Turk-friendly and got all this Turkish experience and lots of Turkish people at Middlesex, and we also had some unfulfilled expectations. And the biggest one was with Middlesex University, joint master's degree, online, work-based learning, introducing new pedagogies into Turkey, and
diplomatic practice.
Oh no, that comes later. I'm talking about the Metu thing, 2008 to that. And this was wonderful. It was made for Turkey. And we were wined and dined. We met the rector. We had everything. And of course, elections at Metu, the rector changes, the team changes, and then we were the program. The same thing happened with Ivy University as well. Lots of promises, and Maggie was there coming. But as what Tushla says, that quite recently, the Consul General, previous Consul General, who's now ambassador to a key country, Qatar, is a graduate of the Middlesex University's work-based learning program.
That was a joint project.
Yeah, it was a joint project. He can share some of the glory. His school of law or something like that. It was under our guidance and his consultation that he received his online masters in soft power, in public diplomacy, and is now currently the ambassador to Qatar. He's a student of Beirut and is a rising star in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we've had major, but also you were there, you went there a number of times and mentored them. North Cyprus. We had a wonderful little, as they call it in, what was it? Thatcher era television thing. I'm winding up now. What I'm saying is that we have a lovely little area in North Cyprus, which was colleagues in North Cyprus would deliver level 7 master's programs in Turkish, in IT, business studies, in Turkish. Then it would come to Middlesex, where it would be quality control of a daily. That's our decided to run. That's the way. It would come to Middlesex, where it would be rigorously, I'm not joking, rigorously controlled, quality control. We also fixed up 2 external examiners, bilingual, and then they would graduate with dual science diplomas. And this was EU funded. It was EU funded, just the capital. And that also imploded because of various things. So there's a lot of hijran in our hearts when we think of this. But of course, finally, and this is quite fine. Koç University is now slightly more open and accommodating. My colleague King has just left the room. We will go into Koç University in November to talk about doctoral training. And we're not going to teach grandmothers how to suck eggs, but we're going to express our good practices at Koç University and on postgraduate programs, because King is engaged in advisor training, and we're going to talk about what it is to become what it is to have a doctoral program and things like that. And there are other sort of exchanges going on with Turkey. And every week I do still send out my little kind of letters and say, would you like to do this? Would you like to do that? And we also in Turkey, I'm sure you get it as well, we get lots of letters. Sevgili hocam, TÜBİTAK'tan bir burs buldum. Sizin üniversitenizdeki can I come for an internship at your university? Can you help me out? So we get things. So people are now kind of finding us, and we kind of moving them out. So find it. So this is the kind of at the end of the 25 years, I can say there are a lot of opportunities, but 3 things, 3 kind of rocks. One, what is it? Mevzuat hasretleri, which means regulation. Regulations and British regulations and the way we do things, etc., do not necessarily fit. 2, language. TOEFL 5.5, TOEFL 6.2, whatever it is. So there's a kind of language. And 3, last but not least, of course, is money, expenses, fees. And those 3 kind of sort of end up scuppering these various things. Finally, I'll just say that we did have an honorary doctorate for Turk, and that was the late Mehmet Duran. And he was given his honorary doctorate at the British consulate in Istanbul by our current Vice Chancellor. And yeah, that's one of our other links with Turkey. That's it.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Ali, and other panel members. and thank you all for staying a distance. So, there is actually a cup of tea or coffee if you'd like it before you go, and a chance to have another chat. And I think our plan is to try and follow up on today, so any suggestions or thoughts gratefully received, just please send them to me or anybody else you might know in this room, and that would be great. So I'd just like to thank all of our speakers, actually. I've really enjoyed it. I think there's a cup of tea at the back if you'd like.
It's all yours.